Before we begin tonight's story, take a deep breath and let your body relax. You don't need to do anything except listen. If these kinds of quiet stories help you fall asleep or simply ease the weight of the day, consider subscribing to the channel so that you will always have a calm history to return to whenever you need it. It costs nothing, it carries no pressure. It is only an invitation to make sure these long stories are always waiting for you, ready to keep you company in the stillness of the night. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Now, let us turn back the pages of time and step slowly into a place where silence was heavy and the air carried a bite so sharp it could steal your breath. Let's travel into the Wild West. Not the romanticized West of dime novels or Hollywood, but the West that truly existed when the first frosts arrived, when the nights grew bitterly long, and when survival itself became the only story worth telling. The first chill of the frontier was a moment no settler ever forgot. Imagine leaving behind everything you knew, setting out across endless plains in summer heat, the wheels of your wagon creaking through dust, the horizon stretching open and golden, giving you the illusion that life here would be wide and free. You arrive with hope still burning, with your dreams of land and harvests and new beginnings intact. Then, one morning, perhaps in October, you wake to find that the grass has turned stiff, coated with a silvery frost, and when you step outside, your breath hangs in the air like smoke. The wind that greets you no longer carries the warmth of sun, but the cutting edge of winter. It seeps through your coat, it burns against your cheeks, and it whispers of something you may not yet be prepared for. Winter in the West is coming, and it will be harder, longer, and lonelier than any you have known before. Many of those who came from the East Coast or from Europe had underestimated the seasons of the plains. They thought of snow as something to be shoveled from doorsteps, a temporary nuisance, a landscape decoration that melted after a few days. But in the West, the cold was not a passing visitor. It was a ruler of months, stretching from late autumn well into spring, and when it arrived with a force that erased all illusions. The winds were not gentle breezes, but relentless gales that swept unbroken across hundreds of miles of flat land. The snow did not dust the earth politely, but buried it, swallowed fences, wagons, and even whole trails. And the frost was not simply cold air, it was a creeping presence that pressed through cracks in walls, froze water buckets solid overnight, and made fingers too stiff to tie knots. The first frost carried with it a heavy realization for the settlers who had only just built their cabins or dugouts. Everything they owned, everything they had labored for during the hot summer months, was now put to the test. The log walls they raised hurriedly while the sun blazed would now have to hold back the icy wind. The firewood they stacked in careless piles would now have to burn slowly, carefully measured, for there would be no more fresh cutting once the snow came deep. The sacks of flour, cornmeal, beans, and salt pork would now have to stretch across months, when gardens lay silent and animals grew thin. That first frost was not only the turning of weather, it was the turning of life itself into survival. Inside those small cabins, the fire became the center of everything. Picture a single room, its walls still raw and unpolished, a dirt floor covered by a rug if the family was lucky, smoke curling from a rough stone hearth. The fire flickered low through the night, guarded like a fragile treasure. A mother might rise several times before dawn to stir the embers, to place another piece of wood, to make sure the room did not turn bitterly cold before morning. Children slept under quilts patched together from scraps of cloth, their breath fogging the air even indoors. Fathers often woke with frost crusting their beards, the glow of the coals reflecting on their faces. To let the fire die was to let the cold win, and no one could afford such a mistake. And yet, even as the cold pressed in, there was a strange kind of beauty to those nights. Step outside, if you dared, and the stars stretched sharper and brighter than you had ever seen. The air was so clear it rang with silence, broken only by the distant cry of a wolf, or the soft groan of a tree shifting under the weight of frost. Snow sparkled like a blanket of glass under the moon. For a brief moment, you could almost forget the hardship and feel instead a kind of awe at how immense and untamed this land truly was. But the awe never lasted long, because the cold always reminded you of its power. Each day in the first chill became a pattern of work. not the lively work of summer harvests, but the heavy, slow work of survival. Firewood had to be split, water had to be carried, livestock had to be tended. The cold turned every simple task into something harder. A bucket of water froze on the way from the stream. Fingers burned from gripping a frozen axe handle. Boots stiffened with ice, making every step painful. Even breathing felt different in the cold, the air so sharp it made your lungs ache. And all the while, the knowledge lingered that this was only the beginning. The first frost was a warning, not the full force of winter. Families felt the weight of confinement as the days shortened. The cabin that seemed spacious when the doors and windows stood open in summer now felt close, crowded, sometimes suffocating. Children grew restless, tempers grew short, and yet everyone had to learn patience. Cabin fever, though not yet named as such, was as real as the frost outside. But there were ways to soften it. Families told stories by firelight, read from worn Bibles or the few books they had carried, mended clothes, and sang songs in the dark evenings. Work was shared, laughter found even in hardship, and the sound of voices together made the small space feel warmer than the fire alone ever could. Those who lived through their first Western winter often said it changed them forever. It taught humility, for you could not fight the cold, only endure it. It taught foresight, for every piece of wood stacked and every jar of food preserved could mean the difference between comfort and hunger. And it taught resilience, for each morning you rose to see your breath in the air and still carried on. The West did not bend for its people, they had to bend for it. And in that bending, in that daily endurance, they discovered strength they had never known they possessed. The dime novels and the movies liked to tell of duels at noon, of sheriffs and outlaws. But for the majority who lived here, the greatest duel was with the cold. It was not glamorous. It was rising from bed when every bone ached with chill, pulling on stiff boots, breaking the ice on the trough so your animals could drink. It was patching the cracks in the cabin walls with rags or mud to keep the drafts from stealing the fire's warmth. It was enduring nights so long that the hours seemed to stretch endlessly, waiting for the first hint of grey dawn to creep into the room. It was a slow, quiet duel, fought not once but every single day until the spring finally returned. And so, the first chill of the frontier was more than just weather. It was a rite of passage, a teacher, a reminder that the land gave nothing easily. Those who endured it carried its memory like a scar and a lesson. They learned that survival is not always about grand acts of bravery, but about countless small acts of care, repeated again and again. Keeping the fire alive, sharing a quilt, saving the last handful of beans for tomorrow, holding on through the long silence of night. This is the story we inherit when we remember the Wild West. Not just the legends of violence and adventure, but the quieter truth of endurance, of families facing the cold together, of people discovering how to live, not in spite of the land, but within it. So as you lie here tonight, listening, let that image stay with you. The frost outside the cabin window, the glow of firelight dancing on wooden walls, the sound of breathing in the stillness as families huddle close. It is a reminder that survival has always been made of ordinary moments, and that in the coldest nights, warmth is found not only in fire but in the closeness of human spirit. Let that thought settle you. Let it carry you gently into rest. And as the embers of our story glow low, remember that sometimes the greatest strength is simply holding on, one night at a time. When people think of the Wild West, they often picture a tidy log cabin standing firm against the prairie winds, smoke rising from the chimney, a symbol of settlement and safety in a wild land. But the truth was rarely so neat. For most who arrived on the frontier, shelter was not something handed to them, not something built easily in a matter of days, but a constant challenge and a struggle that began the very moment the wagon wheels stopped rolling. The land looked open and promising in summer, yet when the first cold winds swept across it, settlers realized just how exposed they truly were. Trees were sparse across the plains, the soil was dry and unyielding, and there were no friendly neighbors with extra boards or nails to lend. Building a home meant using whatever materials lay close at hand, no matter how humble or rough, and making them into something that could keep out the wind and hold in the warmth of a fire. For some, this meant digging straight into the earth. The dugout home was one of the most common and most surprising solutions in those early years. Imagine choosing a hillside, cutting into it with spades and picks, hauling out the soil until you had carved a hollow deep enough for your family. The walls were the very earth itself, thick and insulating, cool in summer and warm in winter. The roof might be made of timber if any was available, or else layers of sod laid carefully across a frame, the grass roots holding the soil together in a living mat. Inside, the floor was often nothing more than packed dirt. The smell of damp earth lingered always, and when rain or snow came heavy, water sometimes seeped through the roof or trickled down the walls. And yet, these dugouts kept families alive. The earth, so hard to plow and so barren of trees, became their shield against the freezing winds. It was not a home of comfort, but it was a home of necessity. On other parts of the plains, where there were no hillsides to carve, settlers turned to sod houses. These were made from bricks of prairie sod, cut with a spade and stacked like rough stone. Each block was heavy, bound by the thick roots of prairie grass. They were stacked carefully, layer upon layer, until walls rose sturdy enough to bear a roof of timber or more sod. From the outside, such homes blended with the land, low and brown, almost as if they were a part of the earth itself. Inside, the walls sometimes shed bits of dirt or insects, and in spring the sod might even sprout new shoots of grass. But sod was plentiful where wood was scarce, and it made walls thick enough to keep out much of the wind. Settlers who lived in these houses often joked that they had built their homes out of the very ground they walked upon, and in truth, those who were fortunate enough to settle near rivers or wooded areas could build cabins of logs. The process was grueling, cutting trees by hand, stripping branches, notching ends, stacking logs one upon another until walls stood tall. Gaps between logs were filled with mud, clay, or moss, a process known as chinking, to block the wind from slipping through. A roof of shingles, if the builder had the skill, or simply overlapping logs covered with earth, would complete the structure. These cabins, though rough, offered a sturdier barrier than sod or dugouts. Yet even here, the cold found its way in through cracks, through poorly fitted doors, through windows that were no more than oiled paper stretched across wooden frames. Still, when the fire glowed in the hearth, these cabins became sanctuaries against the prairie storms. Not everyone even had the time or tools to build such structures. Some settlers spent their first winter in tents or makeshift shelters of canvas stretched across wagon frames. They lined the canvas with animal hides, piled brush against the sides, and prayed for milder weather. Others built shelters partly underground, with only a roof of brush or sod above, so that the earth itself acted as a wall. Every family, every traveler, had to make do with what lay within reach. There was no store to purchase bricks, no carpenter to build a frame, no sawmill to cut lumber. The very landscape dictated the shape of your shelter, and it taught people quickly that pride had little place in survival. A palace made of sod was still a palace if it kept you alive. Inside these rough shelters, life adjusted to the cramped and the simple. A dugout might have a single small window cut from the sod, its opening covered with oiled paper to let in a dim glow of daylight. Sod houses were often damp, the walls cool to the touch, the smell of earth lingering in every breath. Families set their few belongings carefully, sometimes hanging shelves from the beams or storing food in barrels pushed against the walls. In log cabins, smoke sometimes leaked through the roof until eyes watered and clothes smelled constantly of fire. Yet in every case, the inside was far more precious than the outside, for beyond those rough walls lay the unbroken cold of the prairie. Building shelter was not only about walls and roofs, it was also about creating a sense of safety, a place where children could sleep without fear of the wind carrying them away, a place where food could be cooked and eaten without snow drifting onto the fire. For families, shelter became the boundary between wilderness and home, between danger and protection. To step inside was to step into a fragile world of human making, one where the rules of comfort were dictated not by elegance but by necessity. And even in these shelters, people added touches of warmth. Women spread quilts on beds made of straw, patched curtains from scraps of cloth, laid rugs of woven rags across dirt floors. Men built shelves and tables from rough boards, sometimes carving small decorations into the wood. Children decorated with what they could find: feathers, stones, dried flowers. These touches did not stop the wind or the cold, but they gave the family something to call their own, a reminder that even in the harshest of places, people seek beauty. It is easy to imagine the struggle, the way fingers stiffened as settlers hauled sod bricks, the way sweat froze against brows as men lifted logs, the way shoulders ached from digging earth out of a hillside. These were not small tasks, not chores done casually in a weekend. They were weeks of labor, sometimes under the threat of early snow, always under the urgency of time, for winter waits for no one. The cold would come whether the roof was finished or not, and so people worked until hands bled, until backs bent, until the structure stood in some form, however crude, enough to face the wind. Think for a moment of what it must have felt like to lay the last sod brick or notch the final log, to step inside and light a fire for the first time. The relief must have been overwhelming, the sense that perhaps, just perhaps, survival was possible. The walls might still groan in the storm, the roof might still leak, but there was shelter now, a place to gather, a place to endure. In the Wild West, that was enough. These shelters, humble as they were, became the silent heroes of winter. Without them, families would not have lasted the first season. They were not the grand ranch houses or sturdy town buildings that came later. They were the beginnings, the raw, rough roots of settlement. Each sod house, each dugout, each cabin was a story of human resilience written in earth, wood, and sweat. They stood as proof that people could bend the land to their needs, at least enough to endure the cold. And so, when we think of the West, it is worth remembering not only the riders on horseback or the towns built overnight, but also the small, humble shelters that kept families alive through the winter winds. They were not pretty, they were not permanent, but they were enough. Enough to keep out the frost, enough to hold in the fire, enough to let children wake another day and parents dream of spring. The first homes of the frontier were not built of pride. They were built of necessity, of hope, of desperation. And because of them, life in the Wild West, however harsh, was possible. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture a small sod house standing against the endless prairie, its roof low, its chimney smoking faintly. Inside, a family huddles close, the fire flickering on earthen walls, the smell of wood smoke and earth mingling. Outside, the wind howls, the snow drifts high, but inside, there is warmth, there is life, there is survival. That is the story of shelter in the West, the story of how people built not with what they wished for, but with what they had, and in doing so, found a way to endure. When you think of the Wild West, what often comes to mind are images of sun-scorched deserts, cowboys riding under wide blue skies, and golden prairies stretching endlessly across the horizon. But the story of the frontier is not only one of dust and heat, it is also a story of cold, and the relentless challenge of surviving winters that were every bit as harsh and unforgiving as the summers were dry. In many regions of the American frontier, winters could be long, dark, and cruel, with snow piling high and winds cutting through the air like knives. This was the reality faced by settlers, homesteaders, traders, and ranchers who came seeking opportunity. And at the heart of surviving those cold months was one simple necessity: shelter. Shelter was not a luxury. It was the fine line between life and death. Imagine yourself on the prairie in the late 1800s. You have chosen a piece of land to stake your claim, and when the sun sets in October, the wind begins to change. The air grows heavy, sharp, and biting, and you know that winter is on its way. There are no modern conveniences waiting to protect you, no insulated homes, no furnaces humming quietly in the basement, no electricity to chase away the frost. The only thing standing between your family and the bitter cold is the shelter you can build with your own two hands. And so, people built. They built with whatever they had, often improvising, often struggling, but always with determination. The first shelters on the frontier were rarely comfortable, rarely beautiful. They were crude, small, and built with speed in mind. Many early settlers constructed what was known as a dugout. These were simple structures carved directly into the earth. A hillside or embankment would be chosen, and with shovels, picks, and sweat, a family would dig into the soil to create a hollowed-out room. The earth itself formed the walls, and often the roof would be fashioned from logs, branches, and sod laid thick for insulation. Inside, the space was dark and cramped, with dirt floors that grew damp in the winter, and the smell of earth always hanging in the air. Yet dugouts held one powerful advantage: they were warm. The earth provided natural insulation against the freezing winds outside, and a small stove or fire could heat the room enough to keep a family alive. When the temperatures outside dropped well below freezing, dugouts may sound miserable by today's standards, but to those first settlers, they could feel like a refuge, a safe pocket carved from the land itself. For those who settled where wood was available, cabins quickly became the preferred form of shelter. A log cabin on the frontier was often a modest structure, no more than a single room with a dirt floor. Rough-hewn logs, stacked together and sealed with mud or clay to keep out the drafts. The roof might be made of overlapping boards or branches covered in sod. Every crack was a potential leak of warmth, so families worked tirelessly to patch and repair their walls against the wind. The fireplace or small wood stove became the beating heart of these cabins, the place where meals were cooked, warmth was gathered, and family life revolved. At night, everyone often slept close together, huddled under quilts and blankets, with the fire banked to last as long as possible until morning. Still, no matter how well built, the cold would creep in. You can imagine the sounds of a long winter night in such a cabin, the howl of the wind outside, the soft creak of the logs as they settled, the faint hiss of snow brushing against the roof, and inside, the muffled breathing of a family sleeping close, their warmth shared because every degree mattered. For ranchers and cowboys who spent more time outdoors than in, shelter often meant temporary structures. Out on cattle drives or working the open range, men carried little more than canvas tents, sometimes called doghouses for their small, cramped design. These tents provided little insulation against the cold, but they were better than nothing. Cowboys often relied on the warmth of their bedrolls, heavy wool blankets, and the heat of the fire built outside. Sometimes, when the wind was especially brutal, they dug shallow trenches, laid down brush or branches, and stretched the canvas over the top to create a makeshift barrier against the elements. Shelter in these cases was not about comfort, it was about enduring just long enough to see the dawn. Native peoples of the plains and mountain regions had their own ingenious solutions, developed over centuries of living in harmony with the land. The tipi, with its tall, conical shape, was not only portable, but also remarkably effective at keeping in warmth during the cold months. Animal hides, stretched over wooden poles, created strong insulation, and fires built in the center of the tipi could heat the space efficiently, while smoke escaped through a hole at the top. During winter, extra coverings could be added, snow packed around the base to seal in warmth, and animal furs laid thick on the ground to create a barrier from the frozen earth. The tipi was not just a home, it was an adaptable survival tool perfectly suited for both harsh winters and hot summers. When settlers first arrived, many of them learned from these indigenous practices, borrowing ideas and methods that helped them survive when their own approaches fell short. In mining towns high in the Rockies, shelter had to be even sturdier. The mountains could be merciless, with snow piling several feet deep and temperatures dropping far below zero. Miners built cabins from logs and stone, often clustering them close together for protection against avalanches and drifting snow. Windows were small to conserve heat, and chimneys were built low to retain warmth. Life in such a cabin was hard, with frozen water, frost creeping along the inside walls, and the constant chore of keeping the fire alive. Yet for those men who spent their days digging through rock and ice, coming home to even the most basic cabin meant safety. Not every story of shelter on the frontier is one of success. Many settlers underestimated the severity of winters, arriving too late in the year to build a proper home. For some, hastily built shelters collapsed under heavy snow, or thin walls provided no protection against the cold. Tragedies were not uncommon. Diaries from the time speak of families who nearly froze to death, of cattle lost in storms, of nights spent huddled together with nothing but hope and prayer to keep the cold away. These stories remind us how precarious survival could be, how every choice mattered when it came to building a place to withstand winter's grip. And yet, even in these struggles, there was resilience. Neighbors sometimes banded together, building cabins side by side, sharing resources, and watching out for each other. When a storm hit, a community might crowd into one or two of the strongest houses, pooling their strength and warmth. Shelter was not only physical protection, it was also a bond. A reminder that even in the most desolate landscapes, survival often depended on human connection. Think for a moment about the work that went into building such a shelter. No modern tools, no power saws, no trucks to haul materials. Every log had to be felled, stripped, and carried by hand or with the help of horses. Every stone had to be gathered and placed with care, every crack filled by hand. It was labor that left calluses on hands, backs sore, and bodies exhausted. but it was labor that gave life. In the quiet of winter nights, perhaps while the wind rattled against the roof, there must have been moments when a settler sat by the fire, looking at the walls they had built, feeling a mix of exhaustion and pride. That cabin, that dugout, that tipi, or that tented, was proof of their determination, their fight against the relentless cold. Shelter in the Wild West was more than just walls and roofs. It was a symbol of perseverance, a statement carved into the wilderness that said, "We will endure." It was not glamorous, and it was rarely comfortable, but it was essential. To step into one of those crude homes was to step into a fragile but powerful defense against nature's harshest trial. And so, when we think of survival in the Wild West, we must remember these shelters, these humble structures that stood defiantly against the cold winds and heavy snows. They tell the quiet story of resilience of people who refused to be broken by the elements, who used earthwood and stone to carve out a space of safety in a land that often seemed determined to push them away. And as you imagine yourself in that world picture, the relief of walking inside, after a long day of battling the cold, closing the door against the wind, and feeling the first wave of warmth from a small but steady fire. It was not comfort as we know it today, but in that moment, it was everything. When winter approached on the frontier, shelter was only one part of survival. Food, the sustenance that kept people alive and healthy, was just as critical, perhaps even more so when the temperatures began to drop and the days grew shorter. The first frost was a warning that summer's bounty was ending, that gardens would wither, and that the earth would no longer yield its gifts so easily. For families living in dugouts, sod houses, or rough log cabins, every decision about food became a question of life and death. Imagine a family standing outside their cabin, the air sharp against their cheeks, snow swirling in the wind, and knowing that what they ate today might determine whether they survived the next week. The most fortunate settlers arrived with provisions they had packed for the journey west: sacks of flour, salt pork, dried beans, and other staples that could last for months if carefully rationed. Yet even these supplies were finite. If they were not stretched carefully, families could find themselves hungry long before spring. Every meal had to be considered, not just for taste or fullness, but for its caloric content, its ability to sustain the body against the cold, and its capacity to last as long as possible. In many cases, settlers relied heavily on preserved food. Salted meat was a staple. Families would cure pork or beef with large quantities of salt, sometimes smoking it as well, to extend its shelf life. Corn, beans, and other legumes were stored in barrels or sacks, carefully kept away from moisture that could cause rot. In the harsh conditions of winter, even a small mistake, such as a torn sack of flour or a barrel of beans exposed to damp air, could mean that a crucial portion of food was lost. Preservation required attention to detail, patience, and sometimes ingenuity, as settlers learned to adapt to the materials at hand. Canning, for example, became a critical skill in some households. Those who had access to jars, sealing wax, and a hot water bath could preserve fruits and vegetables harvested in the late summer. Tomatoes, berries, and apples were cooked down and stored, creating reserves that could brighten a winter meal, both in flavor and in morale. Even the most basic foods gained new value once they had been carefully stored and sealed against the cold and the damp. Hunting also played an essential role in survival. The plains, forests, and mountains teemed with wildlife, and those who knew how to track, trap, and hunt could supplement their preserved food with fresh meat. Deer, rabbits, wildfowl, and even the occasional bear or bison provided protein and fat necessary to survive bitter days. Hunting required skill and patience, but it was also dangerous. In winter, snow and ice made the terrain treacherous, and animals were often scarce, moving with the seasons or hiding in deep cover. Yet for families who could stretch a hunted rabbit into a stew, or smoke a deer's venison for the winter, hunting was the difference between enduring the cold and succumbing to it. Trapping small animals for fur and meat became another vital strategy. Foxes, rabbits, and beavers could be caught in snares and traps set along known paths or near water. The animals not only provided food, but their pelts could be used to insulate homes, make clothing, or even traded with neighbors and traders for supplies. Settlers quickly learned that every living resource could serve multiple purposes, and the more they could use, the higher their chance of survival. Growing food during the winter was of course impossible, but preparation in the fall determined the strength of the household through the frozen months. Families harvested crops carefully, drying corn, beans, and squash, storing them in bins or barrels, often lined with sawdust or straw to protect against moisture and pests. Potatoes were stored in cool, dry cellars, buried in layers of straw to keep them from freezing. Apples and other root vegetables were kept similarly, and any leftover grains were dried thoroughly to avoid mold. Planning became a year-round task, as the success of the next winter often depended on the careful work of the summer and fall. Settlers learned the importance of rationing. Meals had to be planned in advance, portions measured, and scraps carefully saved for later. Even a thin stew of beans and corn could sustain a family if served properly, and the act of stretching every bite became a mental exercise as much as a physical one. Children learned early not to waste food, and parents taught that every meal counted, that every morsel of sustenance carried the power to keep someone alive. Fishing was another critical resource for those near rivers, streams, or lakes. Anglers would freeze small fish for later consumption or smoke them to preserve them for weeks. The act of fishing in winter required patience, often standing on ice-covered banks in the cold, waiting for a nibble, and yet it rewarded persistence with food that could supplement the daily diet. Water itself could be a challenge, as streams sometimes froze over completely, requiring careful breaking of ice or melting of snow. Once water was acquired, it had to be kept from freezing in containers, a constant concern for families whose survival depended on access to drinkable water for cooking and cleaning. The winter diet was stark. Hot soups and stews became the staple, often consisting of whatever could be spared or hunted. Beans, cornmeal, salted meat, and root vegetables were combined in whatever way the cook could imagine. Herbs and spices were rare, so flavor had to come from the method of cooking or the patience of slow simmering over a wood fire. The warmth of the food was as important as the nourishment it provided. Meals were not only about filling the stomach, but also about warming the body from the inside. The act of cooking became a central feature of daily life, a way to measure time and maintain a rhythm in the long, dark days. Families learned to make use of every part of an animal. Bones were simmered to create broth. Fat was rendered for cooking or for use as fuel in lamps, and hides were saved for clothing or insulation. Nothing was wasted, because everything had value when survival depended on it. Even the smallest scraps of food could make a difference when the winter stretched longer than expected, or when a storm made travel impossible. Community support was also essential. Neighbors often shared meat, milk, eggs, or preserved food. In some cases, families would barter goods, trading furs for flour or a jug of syrup for some salted pork. These small acts of cooperation were not just practical, they were a lifeline, a way to ensure that no one was entirely alone when the winds howled and the snow fell deep. Families who were isolated often relied on creative solutions. Sometimes they would build smokehouses to cure meat more effectively, or granaries raised on stilts to keep rodents away. Storage was critical, and the design of food caches required careful thought about moisture, temperature, and accessibility. Every decision could determine whether supplies lasted through a particularly long or severe winter. In the harshest conditions, settlers even adapted to eating food that they might have considered unpalatable during other seasons. Dried grasses, wild roots, and even insects could supplement diets when supplies ran low. These were not preferred meals, but they were evidence of human adaptability, of the will to survive at all costs. The emotional aspect of food should not be overlooked. Sharing a warm meal, even if meager, provided comfort, reinforced bonds, and helped families endure the isolation and fear that often accompanied deep winter. A pot of stew on the fire was more than sustenance. It was a symbol that life continued despite the cold, the snow, and the distance from the comforts of the world left behind. Nights were long and cold, and the act of gathering and preparing food often stretched well into the evening. Families would tend fires, stirring pots slowly, breaking up frozen lumps of food, and keeping the warmth alive. Even the act of eating became a ritual, a way to conserve energy, to share warmth, and to acknowledge that together they could endure. Food was not just fuel, it was a measure of hope. Those who survived the first winters on the frontier did so not because they were lucky, but because they understood that every bite mattered. Every preserved bean, every salted pork hock, every piece of stored fruit was a link in the chain of survival. They learned the rhythms of the seasons, the timing of harvests, and the importance of preparation. And they learned patience, For sometimes, the cold would come too early, storms would bury supplies, and days would pass with only small scraps to eat. Yet they endured. So tonight, as you imagine yourself in a small cabin on the prairie, with snow piling against the walls and wind rattling through the cracks, picture the careful work of preparing food. Imagine a mother stirring a pot of beans over the fire, the steam rising in gentle swirls, children huddled near, and the father chopping wood outside, ready to keep the fire burning. Picture the barrels of preserved corn and beans stacked neatly in a corner, the smokehouse nearby with hanging cuts of meat, and the small shelves where dried fruits and nuts wait. This was life on the frontier, measured in preparation, ration, and endurance. It was a life where food was not abundant, but it was precious, and it was enough. And when the families sat down to eat, sharing the warmth of the fire and the strength of their provisions, they were not only surviving, they were affirming their presence in a world that demanded resilience, patience, and quiet determination. Fire was life on the frontier. It was warmth, safety, and a beacon in a land that could otherwise seem endless and indifferent. In the winter months, when the cold pressed against every wall, seeped into every floorboard, and crept through even the thickest layers of clothing, fire was the one constant that could keep a family alive. Imagine standing outside a small cabin on a prairie morning, your breath clouding the air, your boots crunching in the frost, and knowing that inside, warmth must be maintained. The fire is more than just heat. It is the lifeline around which all daily tasks revolved. Before modern conveniences, settlers relied entirely on wood and coal to provide the warmth that allowed survival. Cutting and gathering firewood was one of the first priorities in late autumn, and it remained a daily task through the long winter. Every family member had a role. Men would venture into nearby forests or along the edges of wooded areas to fell trees, chop logs, and carry them back to the cabin. The work was grueling, hands blistered and backs aching, muscles straining against frozen wood. Even small branches could become precious fuel if carefully stacked and dried. For a single good night of fire could make the difference between waking in warmth or frostbite. Women often prepared and stored kindling indoors, keeping smaller sticks and dry brush near the hearth to start fires quickly in the morning or after a long absence. Even children played a part, collecting twigs, stacking logs, and learning the skills necessary to manage fire. It was education as much as chore. A hands-on lesson in survival that began from the first winter the family spent on the frontier. Fires themselves were kept alive through ritual and vigilance. The hearth was the heart of the cabin. It was tended constantly, with embers banked at night, so that the fire would last as long as possible. Kindling added carefully, larger logs rotated to maintain a steady heat. In some homes, fireplaces were built with stone or brick, their chimneys designed to draw smoke upward while maximizing warmth inside. In others, a simple metal stove would serve, its small size forcing careful management to make every piece of wood count. Failure to keep the fire burning could be fatal. Snow and wind outside showed no mercy. Temperatures could drop so low that frost formed on the inside walls, and water containers left near the edges of the room would freeze within hours. Families learned to judge the strength of their fire by the feel in the room, by the warmth of their hands, and by how long it could sustain them through the night. Fire provided not only heat but also light. Winter days were short, often dark by mid-afternoon, and many cabins had only small windows, if any at all. A hearth fire became the center of life, illuminating the interior with dancing shadows, giving light for cooking, sewing, mending clothing, or reading by candle or lantern. It was easy to imagine the quiet scenes of frontier evenings, a mother mending a quilt, a child carefully reading from a worn book, the father stoking the fire, all accompanied by the comforting crackle of burning wood. Smoke, though sometimes thick and irritating, became a part of home life. It warned of fire danger, coated walls and ceilings with a thin patina, and carried the scent of wood and hearth into every corner. In winter, when so much of life was limited by cold and darkness, the hearth was also a place of storytelling, of memory, and of family connection. Beyond the cabin, fire served other crucial purposes. Outdoors, temporary fires were built to thaw frozen equipment, to keep livestock safe in extreme cold, or to prepare food when going inside was impossible. During hunting trips, cowboys and frontiersmen would set small fires to warm themselves, smoke meat, or provide light while repairing gear. Knowing how to build a fire that could withstand wind and snow became a skill just as important as knowing how to hunt or cook. Improperly built fires could be extinguished quickly by a gust of wind, leaving a family exposed to the brutal cold. It was an unforgiving lesson in patience and technique. Fire management was also about efficiency. Too large a fire could consume precious wood too quickly. Too small a fire would fail to provide adequate warmth. Settlers learned to control the flames carefully, to add logs strategically, and to save embers overnight. Sometimes, fires were banked with ashes, a method that allowed the heat to last longer by slowly smoldering until it could be reignited in the morning. The balance of fire and fuel dictated daily routines. Because of the cold, activities were planned around the warmth of the hearth. Cooking happened near the center of the cabin. Chores that required leaving the fire, such as fetching water or splitting wood, were done in bursts to minimize exposure. Families learned to dress in layers, move efficiently, and value the fire not just as comfort, but as a survival tool. Fire also became a form of community. In towns and small settlements, neighbors would sometimes combine fires, gathering together in one cabin to share warmth during particularly severe storms. This cooperation could save lives when a blizzard threatened to isolate a family or when resources were low. Fires became markers of social connection, a way to reinforce bonds that were as necessary as the warmth itself. Many settlers kept more than one fire if possible. A smaller secondary fire might be kept in a corner of the cabin, intended for cooking, or a hearth outside might be maintained for animals. The practice of managing multiple fires required vigilance, but it spread the heat more evenly and ensured that critical activities could continue despite the harshness outside. The psychological comfort of fire cannot be overstated. When snow and wind pressed against the cabin walls, a glowing hearth provided reassurance, a sense that despite the brutal conditions, life persisted. Watching the flames dance could calm the mind, soothe worry, and even lull children to sleep. The fire was a reminder of human ingenuity, of the ability to take a spark and create warmth, light, and security. Even in the most primitive conditions, a carefully tended fire could bring a measure of luxury, a small pocket of comfort in a world defined by hardship. There was a rhythm to maintaining a fire that structured life itself. In the morning, it was rekindled from embers banked overnight. Midday, more wood was added to sustain the heat as the air outside remained frigid. Evening brought the largest portion of work, preparing the hearth for the night, adding the last logs, and ensuring that the embers would smolder long after sleep began. This daily attention was not a chore but a ritual, a pattern that gave order to the harsh and unpredictable environment. Families quickly learned to use every part of their resources. Fallen branches, driftwood, scrap lumber, and even dried animal dung might become fuel when wood was scarce. The ability to improvise, to adapt, and to make the most of every available material could mean the difference between warmth and frostbite, between another day of life or suffering. Beyond warmth, fire also protected against illness and infection. Boiling water, cooking meat thoroughly, and keeping the interior air dry and warm helped prevent sickness in conditions where medical help was scarce. The presence of heat and light allowed people to work, mend clothing, and care for the sick, reinforcing fire as a silent guardian of health as well as comfort. The cold outside seemed endless, yet with fire, the interior of a cabin or shelter became a place of life. Families huddled together near the flames, sharing stories, singing songs, reading, sewing, and planning for the days ahead. The glow of the fire illuminated faces lined with weariness, but determined to endure. Each flicker of flame was a small victory over the winter's merciless hold, a symbol that human effort could withstand nature's challenges. Even with fire, the cold could be relentless. Ice could form near windows, frost might creep along walls, and snow might pile against doors. But with diligence, the fire maintained warmth, and with warmth came hope. Settlers learned that a strong hearth was as essential as any tool or weapon in their survival kit. Nights were the hardest, stretching long and dark. Families would sometimes sleep in shifts, keeping the fire alive through the coldest hours. Children were tucked close to parents, quilts layered over bedding, and everyone listened to the wind outside, secure in the knowledge that their carefully tended fire was holding back the harshness of winter. The smell of burning wood became a constant companion, a scent associated with safety, life, and home. Fire, in every crackling moment, reminded settlers that they could endure. And so, as you picture this scene tonight, imagine the soft glow of embers, reflecting on logged walls, the smell of smoke mingling with the scent of cured meat and dried herbs, the warmth radiating outward, keeping frost at bay. Outside, snow drifts silently over the prairie. Inside, a family gathers, tending the hearth, stirring the stew, sharing warmth and quiet conversation. The fire is steady, resilient, and unyielding, just like the people who built it, fed it, and relied upon it to survive the winter months. It is the quiet hero of the frontier, the source of life in a harsh, indifferent land. And it is through the fire that settlers claimed a small victory every day, a testament to human endurance, skill, and the deep need for warmth and comfort in the midst of relentless cold. Survival in the bitter winters of the Wild West depended as much on what people wore as on the shelter they built or the fire they tended. The cold could pierce even the thickest walls if the body was exposed, and frostbite, hypothermia, and illness were constant threats. Clothing became a first line of defense, a portable shield against relentless wind, snow, and ice. Imagine stepping outside a sod house, the wind whipping across the open plains, your cheeks stinging, your fingers numb, and realizing that the difference between enduring and suffering would be determined by the layers you wore. Settlers, miners, cowboys, and families all had to learn quickly how to dress for survival, often improvising and combining materials in ways that were inventive, practical, and sometimes uncomfortable. Wool was the most valued material for frontier clothing. Thick wool coats, blankets, and socks provided insulation against the cold, retaining body heat even when damp with snow or sleet. Sheep were common in some settlements, and families would shear them, spin the wool, and weave it into cloth or felt two-fashion garments. For those without ready access to wool, furs became essential. The hides of rabbits, foxes, deer, and even larger animals like bears were used to create coats, hats, mittens, and boots. These furs were prized not only for warmth but also for durability, their natural oils repelling moisture and insulating the body. Every piece of clothing mattered, from head to toe, because even a small exposure to freezing temperatures could lead to frostbite. Layering was a skill learned from necessity. Settlers would wear multiple garments, sometimes several shirts or tunics, under heavy coats. Leggings of wool or fur were tied snugly around the legs, and thick socks or moccasins protected feet from the frozen ground. Scarves, often homemade from wool scraps, wrapped around the neck and face, shielding sensitive skin from windburn. Hats, gloves, and mittens were essential. Bare hands could not last long in the icy gusts that swept across the open prairie. Children were dressed similarly, though often with hand-me-downs, layered to maximize warmth, despite the limitations of available materials. Clothing was not just a matter of warmth, but also mobility. Settlers had to move through snow, haul wood, cook, and tend animals, all while staying protected. Garments were often tailored to allow freedom of movement, with reinforced areas where work caused friction or where heavy coats might have slits or vents to facilitate bending and lifting, while boots were designed to be sturdy, insulated, and resistant to wet conditions. Improvisation was common. When wool or fur ran short, settlers might layer blankets over clothing, use straw as insulation inside shoes or coats, or sew together scraps of leather, canvas, and cloth to create makeshift garments. Even the simplest solution, such as stuffing sleeves or boots with hay, could mean the difference between enduring a long day outdoors or returning to the cabin with frostbitten fingers or toes. Clothing also carried a social and practical function. Frontiersmen often learned to adapt the garments of Native Americans, incorporating moccasins, leggings, and fur-lined cloaks to survive in extreme conditions. These designs were tested over generations and suited to the specific challenges of the land. Settlers borrowed these techniques, blending them with what they had brought from the East, creating a hybrid of practicality and necessity. For those working on the open range, such as cowboys and ranch hands, clothing had to withstand exposure to wind and snow while remaining functional for long hours on horseback. Heavy coats and chaps protected against snow, mud, and thorny brush. Wide-brimmed hats shielded the face from falling snow, while gloves protected hands from cold rains. Layering was essential, but it had to allow the flexibility to ride, rope cattle, and manage livestock. Even miners in the mountains adapted their clothing to the extremes of elevation and temperature. Thick woolen shirts, Layered coats and fur hats were common, with mittens often lined with additional fur. Boots were reinforced for climbing icy slopes and walking through snowdrifts. Every piece of clothing had a purpose, and every stitch might be a matter of survival. Clothing had to be maintained. Wet garments could freeze solid in the cold, so settlers and frontiersmen learned to dry clothes near the hearth, rotate garments, and repair tears immediately. Wool was especially valuable because it retained heat even when damp, but cotton and linen, often used for underlayers, required more care. Sewing, mending, and repurposing old clothes were daily tasks necessary to ensure that each family member remained protected. Hats were particularly important. In the West, a simple hat could prevent heat loss through the head, which accounts for a significant portion of body heat. Fur hats, wide-brimmed leather hats, or layered cloth hats provided insulation and shielded the face from biting winds. Scarves and bandanas, wrapped around the face and neck, were often tucked into collars to trap heat, leaving only the eyes exposed to the elements. Hands and feet required constant attention. Frostbite could develop in minutes if extremities were exposed, so mittens lined with fur or wool were essential. Layered socks and insulated boots kept feet warm even while walking through deep snow or standing on frozen ground. Settlers sometimes improvised with straw, dried grasses, or extra cloth, stuffing shoes or sleeves to add insulation. Footwear maintenance was critical. Leather boots needed to be kept dry, conditioned, and repaired. In areas of deep snow, settlers would wrap their legs with cloth or strips of leather to prevent snow from entering boots, a practice borrowed from native techniques. Gloves were repaired, mittens doubled, and extra pairs were kept near the fire to dry overnight. Clothing was also adapted for sleep. At night, when families huddled together for warmth, wool blankets and extra garments were layered to conserve heat. Even in a heated cabin, the cold could seep through floors and walls, so it was common to sleep in almost all of the layers worn during the day, with extra quilts or animal hides spread over bedding. The act of dressing for survival was a ritual, a careful balance between comfort, protection, and practicality. Settlers learned to judge the cold, to adjust layers as the wind changed, and to prepare for storms that could arrive suddenly. Clothing was never simply fashion. It was preparation for life and death. Children learned these skills early. They were taught to layer properly, to wrap scarves tightly, and to check the dryness of socks and mittens. Play often took place near the fire, conserving energy and warmth, but they also learned to move efficiently outdoors, navigating snow and ice with care. Every aspect of clothing was a lesson in survival, in understanding the body's needs in extreme conditions. Settlers also made use of animal pelts beyond coats and hats. Furs were used as lining in clothing, in gloves, around boots, and even inside bedding to retain warmth. The use of multiple layers of fur and wool created insulation that could withstand nights well below freezing. The creativity in combining materials was remarkable, a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity. Maintenance extended to repairs. Holes, tears, and worn edges were fixed immediately to prevent heat loss. Families patched clothing with leather, cloth scraps, or extra wool, often sewing by firelight. Needles, thread, and patience were invaluable tools, as a small tear in a mitten or boot could expose a hand or foot to frostbite. Settlers learned to anticipate wear, making reinforcements in high-stress areas, such as elbows, knees, and soles, to ensure longevity through the winter. Beyond physical protection, clothing had an emotional function. Wearing familiar layers, quilts, or hand-sewn garments provided a sense of security and comfort. The smell of wool, the texture of fur, and the familiarity of worn coats reinforced a sense of home and family cohesion. In the harsh environment of the frontier, where isolation was common, these small comforts mattered deeply. The settlers of the Wild West mastered the art of dressing for survival through observation, adaptation, and practice. They borrowed methods from indigenous peoples, experimented with available materials, and constantly refined their techniques. The combination of wool, fur, layered garments, and careful maintenance was a constant battle against the cold, but it was effective. In many cases, it meant the difference between enduring a long winter and succumbing to frostbite, hypothermia, or illness. Imagine the daily routines revolving around clothing. Before leaving the cabin, garments were layered carefully, scarves tied snugly, boots laced and adjusted, gloves checked for warmth, Upon returning, clothing was dried near the fire, repaired if necessary, and prepared for the next outing. Clothing was not just personal protection, it was a critical tool in the rhythm of survival. And so, the people of the frontier endured. Children learned patience and careful attention. Adults mastered layering, maintenance, and improvisation. Families worked together to ensure that no one ventured outside unprepared, that every exposed extremity was shielded, and that each person returned home safely. Clothing was not decoration. It was a vital part of life, intimately connected to every other aspect of winter survival: shelter, fire, food, and community. And as you picture these scenes tonight, imagine a family stepping out into the snow, wrapped in layers of wool, fur, and cloth. The wind cuts sharply, but the layers hold firm. Inside the cabin, extra clothing hangs near the fire to dry. Quilts await the night, and boots and mittens are carefully repaired and prepared for the next day. Clothing, in all its careful design, adaptation, and maintenance, becomes more than fabric. It is life preserved, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of those who dared to survive in the Wild West. Water was life, yet in the harsh winters of the Wild West, it became one of the greatest daily challenges. Rivers and streams froze, wells became icy, and snow-covered landscapes made access to fresh water laborious and, at times, dangerous. Imagine stepping outside a small cabin at dawn, snow crunching beneath your boots, the air cutting your face with frost, and knowing that you must fetch water before the sun climbs higher, before the cold saps your strength, and before your chores can even begin. Water was necessary not only for drinking, but also for cooking, cleaning, caring for animals, and maintaining the household. Without it, survival became far more precarious. In many settlements, wells provided a reliable source of water, but even these required careful management in winter. The surface could freeze over entirely, and settlers learned to break ice carefully, often using long poles or chisels to reach the water beneath. A bucket might be lowered slowly, swinging to avoid contact with frozen edges, then hauled back with a heavy, cold load that could chill hands to the bone. Gloves were essential, but even thick mittens could only do so much when handling freezing water. Streams and rivers, when unfrozen, were equally challenging. Snow and ice often formed treacherous banks, requiring careful navigation to avoid slipping or falling. Water might be carried in wooden buckets, iron pails, or even hollowed-out containers, each with its own difficulties. The weight, the cold, and the threat of spillage made every trip a test of strength and endurance. Rainwater and snow provided supplemental sources, but only after it had been melted or collected properly. Snow could be gathered and melted over the fire, providing both hydration and water for cooking. Yet melting snow required fuel, patience, and careful attention. Too little fire would slow the process, and a careless approach could waste precious heat or allow the water to become contaminated. Hygiene was another ongoing challenge in winter. With temperatures plunging and water scarce, washing became infrequent and careful. Families often washed only faces and hands, relying on snow to refresh clothing or boots, and scraping off dirt when necessary. Hair was braided, covered, or tucked into hoods to conserve warmth. Despite these limitations, settlers understood the importance of keeping clean where possible, particularly to prevent illness during a time when colds, pneumonia, and infections could become deadly. Clothing itself sometimes had to double as protection and hygiene aid. Boots were scraped of snow and mud, outer layers brushed or shaken to remove dirt, and fur linings were aired near the fire to prevent mold and rot. Even the act of sitting near the hearth for warmth became an opportunity to dry damp clothing, clean hands, or attend to minor injuries. Hygiene and water were deeply tied to daily routines. Mornings often began with fetching water for cooking and washing, tending the animals, and preparing breakfast. Midday might involve melting snow for additional use, or ensuring that animals had access to unfrozen water. Evenings could include more water chores, such as boiling water for tea, cleaning dishes, or preparing clothes for the next day. The rhythm of winter survival revolved around these cycles, shaped as much by the availability of water as by sunlight or temperature. Ice itself became a valuable resource and sometimes a hazard. Large blocks could be cut from frozen rivers or lakes and stored in ice houses, insulated with sawdust or straw, to be used during warmer months. At the same time, traveling over ice required caution. Thin ice could break underfoot, and frozen streams could conceal dangerous currents beneath a deceptive surface. Settlers and children learned early to judge ice thickness, to test surfaces with sticks, and to move carefully to avoid accidents. Snow, while beautiful from a distance, created both obstacles and opportunities. It could be shoveled or packed to provide insulation for root cellars or temporary shelters. Yet it also made daily chores more exhausting. Carrying water, firewood, or food through deep drifts was slow and laborious, requiring stamina and careful balance. Clothing had to accommodate these tasks, layering warmth with flexibility for bending, lifting, and climbing. Settlers quickly developed a practical understanding of frostbite, hypothermia, and dehydration. Cold air could dry skin and lips, while exposure to frozen water could numb fingers and toes within minutes. Children were taught to recognize the early signs of frostbite, to seek warmth near the fire, and to protect extremities with layers of cloth, wool, or fur. Adults knew that even brief exposure without protection could be dangerous, and adapted daily routines to minimize risk. Animals also complicated water management. Livestock required unfrozen water, so settlers often had to break ice in troughs, carry water from wells, or use heated containers. Failure to provide animals with adequate water could result in illness or death, reducing the family's food supply and adding to the overall challenge of winter survival. Ice and snow also dictated cooking and food storage. Frozen ground made digging for root vegetables or maintaining root cellars difficult. Snow could protect stored food from thawing and spoiling, acting as insulation. Yet too much snow could bury supplies entirely, requiring careful monitoring. Water used for cooking had to be boiled to ensure safety, particularly in small settlements where contamination was a concern. The mental strain of managing water, hygiene, and ice during long winters cannot be underestimated. Settlers lived with constant awareness of scarcity and exposure. Every trip outdoors required planning: what tools to bring, what clothing to wear, how much energy it would take, and what risks were involved. The cumulative effort of fetching water, melting snow, cleaning clothing, and maintaining hygiene created a quiet endurance, a steady rhythm of labor intertwined with survival instincts. Settlers shared techniques and solutions. Neighbors taught each other how to build insulated ice balls, how to melt snow efficiently, and how to manage chores without wasting energy. Community knowledge became essential in preventing illness and maintaining comfort, reinforcing the idea that survival often relied on cooperation and shared experience. At night, the water and ice challenges were never far from mind. Families might check the thickness of ice over a well or stream, ensure that containers of water were protected from freezing, and prepare for the tasks of the following day. Even when resting, the mind remained attuned to the environment, anticipating the next need, the next challenge, and the next opportunity to secure essential resources. Emergencies were a constant concern. Pipes or wells could freeze unexpectedly. Snowstorms could isolate a cabin for days, and illnesses could spread quickly without access to clean water. Settlers learned contingency planning, storing extra water, keeping ice broken near vital access points, and teaching children how to manage simple chores in case adults were incapacitated. Water, ice, and hygiene were thus intimately connected with every aspect of frontier life. Drinking water fueled the body, cooking water sustained meals, ice preserved food, and hygiene maintained health. Without attention to these necessities, even a well-built shelter, a strong fire, and adequate clothing could not guarantee survival. The combination of labor, skill, and vigilance required to manage water in winter was extraordinary. Every bucket fetched, every ice block broken, every chore completed was a step toward safety, a testament to human ingenuity and endurance in a landscape that offered no leniency. And yet, there was also a quiet beauty in these challenges. The crystalline sparkle of ice on branches, the reflective surface of a frozen stream, the soft hush of freshly fallen snow, all became part of the sensory world settlers inhabited. These landscapes, while dangerous, carried moments of awe, moments that reminded people of the extraordinary environment they were part of, and the remarkable adaptability they had developed to survive within it. So tonight, as you imagine a small cabin in the Wild West winter, picture the careful work involved in managing water and ice. See the parents breaking the surface of a frozen well, the children carrying buckets across snow-laden ground, the fire inside melting snow for cooking, and the careful stacking of supplies to prevent freezing. Hear the crunch of boots on ice, the soft hiss of snow falling from the roof, and the quiet murmurs of family members coordinating chores. Imagine the labor, the skill, the attention to detail, and the persistence required, day after day, week after week, to ensure that clean water was available, that hygiene could be maintained, and that survival remained possible. Water, ice, and hygiene were silent challenges, often unseen in tales of the frontier, yet they were as crucial to survival as fire, food, or shelter. The people who mastered them endured long winters, preserved life, and created routines that allowed families to thrive even in the most hostile conditions. In the quiet glow of a hearth, with children warming hands near embers and parents carefully managing chores, the work of water, ice, and hygiene became a rhythm, a steady assurance that life could continue, that survival was possible, and that the harshness of winter, though formidable, could be met with human resilience, patience, and careful attention. Survival in the bitter winters of the Wild West was never guaranteed, and while stored food, fire, and clothing could sustain life for a time, the ability to hunt, trap, and forage often made the difference between enduring the cold and succumbing to it. Imagine a vast snow-covered prairie stretching endlessly in every direction, a wind whipping across frozen ground, and a lone hunter stepping carefully over ice-covered rocks, rifle slung across the shoulder, eyes scanning the tracks left in the snow. Every footprint, every broken twig, every faint movement carried significance, for the landscape offered both the promise of sustenance and the danger of scarcity. Hunting was not a casual pastime. It was a discipline, a daily struggle that required patience, skill, and intimate knowledge of the land. Settlers learned to track deer, rabbits, foxes, and game birds, interpreting subtle signs in the snow or brush to determine the direction and distance of animals. They moved slowly, deliberately, conserving energy in the freezing air, mindful of the sound of boots crunching over frost or ice. The act of hunting in winter required understanding the behavior of animals. Deer, for example, moved differently in the snow, often sticking to sheltered areas or following established trails. Rabbits burrowed under brush or snow, leaving only small, delicate tracks. Birds became harder to find, and their migration patterns meant that some food sources were only seasonally available. Success depended on observation, timing, and the ability to anticipate the movements of prey, all skills honed over months and years of living closely with the land. Firearms were precious and maintained with care. Rifles, shotguns, and pistols had to be cleaned and protected from moisture that could freeze or corrode metal. Ammunition was valuable and often scarce, so shots had to count. Hunters learned to wait patiently for the perfect opportunity, to conserve energy and resources, and to rely on the precision of their aim. Hunting was also dangerous. Snow could conceal uneven ground or ice-covered streams, and exposure to the cold could be deadly if a trip went longer than expected. Predators, such as wolves or coyotes, sometimes followed the hunter's trail, drawn by the scent of prey, adding another element of risk. Trapping small animals became an equally essential strategy. Settlers would construct snares and traps along known paths, near brush, or alongside frozen streams. These traps required care in setting, knowledge of animal behavior, and constant attention to avoid spoilage or theft by other wildlife. Rabbits, foxes, and muskrats provided both food and furs, making them doubly valuable. Each trap was positioned thoughtfully, often using branches, rocks, or snow to camouflage it, ensuring that the prey could be caught efficiently and safely. Settlers also used techniques learned from indigenous peoples, adapting strategies that had been refined over generations. Snowshoes were sometimes worn to travel silently over deep drifts, and scents were masked using mud or natural foliage to approach animals undetected. Patience was vital, as hours could pass with no movement, and the hunter or trapper had to remain still, conserving warmth and energy while waiting for the moment of opportunity. Foraging supplemented hunting and trapping, particularly when game was scarce or difficult to find. Families searched for winter greens, roots, berries, and nuts that could be harvested even under snow. Some roots could be dug from the frozen ground with care, often requiring knowledge of their locations from prior seasons. Berries, preserved from late autumn, might be stored in ice or snow to prevent spoilage, creating a supply of vitamins that prevented disease and strengthened the body against cold. Knowledge of edible plants was critical, as some could be poisonous if consumed. Families taught their children to recognize safe roots and leaves, to avoid dangerous ones, and to respect the delicate balance of nature that provided sustenance while demanding caution. Hunting and foraging were never solitary tasks. Families often worked together, coordinating trips, sharing knowledge, and splitting duties to maximize efficiency. A father might track deer while the mother gathered roots and berries, while children maintained traps or carried small supplies. Each person's contribution mattered, and the rhythm of survival depended on cooperation, skill, and careful observation. Preservation of hunted and foraged food was a daily challenge. Meat had to be smoked, salted, or frozen immediately to prevent spoilage. Small game was often roasted over open fires, while larger animals required careful butchering, drying, or smoking. The cold aided preservation but was never enough alone. Attention and effort were essential. Fur, too, required preparation. Skins had to be cleaned, stretched, and dried before they could be used for clothing, insulation, or trade. Each step demanded knowledge, patience, and care, as improperly prepared furs or meat could be ruined, leaving families vulnerable during the long winter. The mental aspect of hunting and foraging was equally taxing. Endless snow, biting wind, and long hours of observation required focus, resilience, and persistence. Successes were often smaller: single rabbit caught, a deer tracked for hours, a handful of berries discovered under snow, but they mattered profoundly. Each provision could sustain life, contribute to warmth, or provide nourishment for children and elders. Stories of skill and ingenuity circulated among settlers. Some learned to follow animal tracks in the snow to hidden feeding grounds. Others devised intricate traps that captured multiple rabbits at once, while some discovered hidden patches of hardy winter plants that could supplement diets. These stories were passed along, becoming part of the collective knowledge that allowed frontier families to endure. The seasons dictated the availability of food, requiring foresight and preparation. Hunters anticipated migration patterns and breeding seasons, ensuring that traps were set when animals were most likely to be caught. Foragers remembered where roots or wintergreens could be found and stored them in advance. Every decision had consequences, and a miscalculation could mean hunger or hardship. Hunting and foraging were also about conserving energy. In extreme cold, exertion burned calories quickly, and a failed hunting trip could leave a person weakened, unable to maintain body heat, and vulnerable to the elements. Settlers learned to move efficiently, to conserve energy, and to balance the effort of pursuing food with the necessity of sustaining warmth and health. Community knowledge played a critical role. Neighbors shared tips about animal behavior, safe routes, and locations of hidden food sources. Trading hunted or trapped goods for other necessities reinforced bonds and ensured that even in scarcity, resources could be stretched. Cooperation and communication became survival tools as vital as rifles, traps, or boots. Night brought its own challenges. Animals moved differently under moonlight. Snow reflected the pale glow of the sky, and tracks could be obscured by drifting snow. Hunters learned to navigate in low light, using careful observation and memory to track prey and avoid danger. Fires were kept burning not only for warmth, but also to process food brought in before nightfall, to smoke meat, or to melt snow for drinking water. Food storage remained a constant concern. Smokehouses, cellars, and insulated containers allowed families to extend the shelf life of hunted and foraged goods. Meat might be hung near the fire to dry slowly, roots kept in straw-lined bins, and small game preserved in cold storage. The process was ongoing, meticulous, and vital to survival. Children observed and participated as they were able. They learned to set traps, recognize tracks, carry supplies, and identify edible plants. These lessons were practical, ensuring that knowledge passed from one generation to the next, equipping young settlers with skills that could one day save their lives. Weather always dictated strategy. Blizzards could make travel impossible, cover tracks, and force families to rely on previously stored food. Mild days might be used to venture further afield, to hunt larger game, or to forage for additional supplies. Settlers constantly read the landscape, understanding the interplay of snow, wind, and animal behavior, adapting plans to maximize safety and efficiency. Even the process of cleaning and preparing food required attention to detail. Bones were used to create broth, fat was rendered for cooking or fire, and furs were carefully maintained for warmth or trade. Nothing was wasted, and every step reinforced the connection between survival and skill, between human ingenuity and the harsh reality of winter. There was also a rhythm to life that hunters and foragers followed, a cycle dictated by the need for food, the constraints of daylight, and the dangers of exposure. Trips were planned carefully, tasks divided among family members, and each day balanced effort with conservation of energy. Success was measured not only in quantity of food caught, but also in efficiency, safety, and the ability to maintain provisions over the long months of winter. So tonight, as you imagine the frozen plains and forested hills of the Wild West, picture the careful patience of a hunter, reading tracks in the snow, the skillful placement of a trap, the delicate discovery of edible roots beneath a thin layer of frost, and the constant attention to preserving every morsel. Hear the crunch of boots on icy ground, the soft whisper of wind through bare trees, and the faint crackle of a fire processing the day's catch. Imagine children observing and learning, families working together, and the quiet persistence that allowed life to continue. Hunting, trapping, and foraging were more than survival strategies. They were lessons in observation, patience, and the connection between human beings and the land. They were exercises in endurance, ingenuity, and care, requiring a combination of skill, courage, and attentiveness that defined life on the frontier. Every rabbit caught, every deer tracked, every root uncovered beneath the snow was a triumph, a moment of human mastery over the merciless environment, and a testament to the determination and adaptability that allowed people to endure even the harshest winters. Winter on the frontier was merciless, and one of the greatest tests of endurance for settlers was the ability to create a shelter capable of withstanding wind, snow, and freezing temperatures. The prairie, the mountains, and the valleys offered little protection, leaving families vulnerable unless they had prepared carefully. Imagine a vast expanse of snow stretching endlessly, the wind howling across the frozen land, and a small cabin standing firm against the storm, a warm glow from its hearth spilling through frost-covered windows. That cabin, humble and often built by hand, represented not just a home but a lifeline, a place where survival could be managed and life endured. The design and construction of shelters varied depending on available materials, terrain, and the skill of those who built them. Log cabins were among the most common types, with thick timber walls providing insulation and stability. The logs were often notched at the corners and carefully stacked to minimize gaps through which wind could penetrate. Chinking, a mixture of mud, clay, straw, or moss, was applied between logs to seal cracks, reduce drafts, and maintain warmth. In forested regions, cabins could be large enough to house extended families, while on the plains, sod houses were common, built by stacking blocks of thick earth over a wooden framework. Sod offered excellent insulation, retaining heat during the day and slowing the escape of warmth at night. Inside, these homes were simple but functional. Floors might be covered with planks, straw, or rush mats to provide insulation from the cold ground. Roofs were sometimes thatched or covered with overlapping planks, insulated with moss, straw, or mud to retain heat. Windows were small to reduce heat loss, often fitted with shutters or animal hides, and doors were tightly fitted and layered to block drafts. Every detail mattered because even the smallest opening could allow the cold to seep in and sap warmth from the interior. The interior design focused on creating a centralized source of heat. The hearth, often built of stone or brick, was the heart of the home, radiating warmth to every corner. Families arranged their living spaces around it, sleeping and working close enough to benefit from the heat while leaving less used areas cooler. Conserving fuel, firewood, stored indoors or in nearby sheds, was stacked carefully to stay dry and accessible, ensuring that warmth could be maintained even during the harshest blizzards. Insulation extended beyond walls and roofs to every aspect of the home. Blankets, quilts, furs, and hides were draped over beds, furniture, and even walls to conserve heat. Windows might be covered with layers of cloth or oiled paper to reduce drafts, while doors were reinforced with extra layers of fabric or fur. Settlers understood that warmth was cumulative. A small reduction in heat loss could dramatically improve comfort and survival. The construction and maintenance of winter shelters demanded labor, skill, and foresight. Logs had to be felled, stripped, and transported, while sod blocks were cut and positioned with precision. Roofs had to withstand heavy snow loads, requiring careful planning and reinforcement. Chimneys had to be built to draw smoke while preventing heat from escaping. Every aspect of the shelter was a balance between protection, efficiency, and available resources. Shelters were adapted to the terrain. On exposed plains, windbreaks such as fences, brush, or earthen berms were built to shield homes from prevailing winds. In mountainous regions, cabins might be nestled against hillsides or within tree lines to provide natural protection. Even small adjustments could reduce wind exposure, prevent snowdrifts from burying doors, and make life inside more manageable. The arrangement of furniture and living spaces was strategic. Beds were placed on raised platforms or near the hearth to maximize warmth, while workspaces were positioned to benefit from daylight and proximity to heat. Animals, such as dogs, chickens, or even small livestock, were sometimes housed partially inside, providing warmth while remaining functional. Attention to detail extended to ventilation. While drafts were dangerous, proper airflow was necessary to prevent smoke buildup and maintain air quality. Chimneys and vents were managed carefully, ensuring that fires could burn efficiently without filling the cabin with smoke. This required constant vigilance, particularly during long winter nights when the fire might smolder slowly. Community knowledge played a role in shelter survival. Settlers often shared construction techniques, tips for insulation, and advice for withstanding storms. Stories of well-built homes surviving blizzards, while poorly constructed cabins failed, circulated widely, reinforcing the importance of preparation, skill, and attention to detail. Temporary shelters were also vital, especially for hunters, trappers, or travelers caught in winter storms. Snow shelters, lean-tos, and canvas tents provided essential protection in emergencies. These structures were often small and insulated with snow, branches, or hides, offering a temporary haven until permanent shelter could be reached. Their construction required careful understanding of wind patterns, snow accumulation, and insulation principles, often learned through trial, error, and observation. Even minor details had life-saving consequences. Doors were sometimes lined with straw or cloth, windows covered with multiple layers, and cracks around logs meticulously sealed. Roofs were angled to shed snow, preventing collapse. Floors were insulated with brush or rushes, while bedding was layered with quilts, furs, and blankets. Every layer was calculated, every material used intentionally, creating an environment that could endure temperatures far below freezing. Families adapted their daily routines to complement their shelters. Chores were planned to minimize exposure. Travel was scheduled during daylight hours, and tasks requiring extended time outdoors were often broken into manageable segments. The shelter became a center of life, a place where food was prepared, clothing repaired, stories shared, and rest taken. It was a hub of warmth, activity, and quiet endurance. Maintenance of the shelter was ongoing. Roofs were checked for leaks, doors adjusted to prevent drafts, and chimneys cleaned to ensure proper airflow. Logs were treated or replaced as needed, and insulation replenished when materials compressed or decayed. Neglect could quickly lead to discomfort, illness, or structural failure, making vigilance a daily necessity. Winter storms tested every aspect of a shelter's construction. Blizzards could pile snow against walls, block doors, and strain roofs. High winds could expose weaknesses in walls or chimneys, and sub-zero temperatures could freeze stored water or food. Settlers developed strategies to endure these challenges, from piling snow for additional insulation to reinforcing structures with extra logs or sod. Inside, life continued despite the storm, centered on the hearth and the careful management of warmth, food, and water. Children learned the intricacies of shelter survival alongside adults. They observed repairs, helped stack firewood, and learned the importance of minimizing drafts and conserving heat. These lessons were practical, forming the foundation of knowledge that would be essential throughout their lives. The sense of security provided by a well-built shelter was profound. Beyond physical warmth, it offered mental comfort, a place to gather, rest, and feel protected against the indifferent forces of winter. The glowing hearth, the layered quilts, and the thick walls became symbols of human resilience and ingenuity in a world defined by cold and isolation. Settlers also used natural features to enhance shelter. Trees, hills, and rock formations provided windbreaks, additional insulation, or natural camouflage. Snow could be piled strategically against walls to add extra protection, while debris, brush, and even frozen vegetation served as buffers against cold air. These adaptations were learned through experience and observation, refined over years of trial and error. The mental aspect of shelter survival was equally important. Knowing that a secure structure existed allowed families to plan, work, and endure without constant fear. It reinforced routines, enabled careful preparation for storms, and provided a place of stability amidst a landscape that could be harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Shelter was also a space for creativity and care. Families decorated interiors with handmade textiles, arranged spaces for comfort, and used furs and blankets, not only for warmth, but also to create a sense of homeliness. Even in the most Spartan cabins, attention to detail, pride in craftsmanship, and care for family comfort were evident, illustrating the human desire for comfort and dignity even under extreme conditions. Emergencies, however, tested every skill. Roofs could collapse under heavy snow, fires might fail, or wind could breach walls. Settlers prepared contingency plans, knowing how to reinforce weak points, create temporary windbreaks, and protect vital supplies. They also shared knowledge with neighbors, understanding that cooperation could be life-saving in extreme weather. Nighttime presented unique challenges. Temperatures dropped sharply, and the cabin became the center of warmth and safety. Families layered bedding, positioned children near the fire, and monitored the hearth to ensure that embers would last until morning. The rhythm of the day, shaped by chores, fire, and food, culminated in a quiet period of vigilance, where attention to shelter could mean the difference between comfort and peril. Even small details mattered. Windows were checked for drafts, doors adjusted to block wind, and floors swept or layered with additional material to reduce heat loss. Chimneys were cleared, firewood replenished, and bedding fluffed or rearranged. Every action contributed to the ongoing maintenance of the environment, ensuring that the shelter could withstand another long night of cold and wind. The sense of mastery over the environment was subtle but profound. A well-built shelter, maintained with care and attention, provided not only physical protection, but also reassurance, stability, and a space where life could continue despite the harshness of the world outside. Families developed routines, traditions, and practices that centered around their homes, creating a rhythm of life attuned to winter's demands. So tonight, as you picture a small log cabin or sod house standing firm against snow-laden plains or frozen hills, imagine the careful work that went into its construction. See the thick walls, the sealed windows, the layered roof, and the hearth glowing at its center. Picture a family arranging quilts, stacking firewood, and tending the fire, each member contributing to the ongoing effort of maintaining warmth and shelter. Hear the wind outside, feel the quiet calm of a protected interior, and understand that every log, every layer of insulation, and every careful repair was a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. Shelter was more than wood or sod. It was life itself, a safe harbor in a world defined by winter's merciless hand, a place where warmth, care, and perseverance combined to create security and comfort for those who dared to endure the frontier. Winter in the Wild West was not just a season. It was an elemental force that demanded respect, careful planning, and constant vigilance. Settlers faced months of biting wind, snowdrifts that could bury fences and doors, and nights so cold that even a well-tended fire seemed insufficient. In such an environment, the most vital tool for survival was a sturdy, insulated shelter. The cabin, often humble in appearance, represented more than a home. It was a refuge, a place of warmth, safety, and sustenance. Families who succeeded in building and maintaining their shelters endured, while those who did not sometimes succumbed to exposure, illness, or frostbite. The construction of these shelters varied widely, depending on available resources, terrain, and the skills of the settlers themselves. In forested regions, log cabins were common. Large timbers were felled, stripped, and notched to fit tightly at the corners. This interlocking design provided structural stability, while gaps were filled with chinking made of mud, clay, straw, or moss to prevent drafts. Every detail mattered because even a small opening could allow cold air to infiltrate the interior, sapping warmth and comfort. In the open plains, where timber was scarce, settlers often built sod houses. Thick blocks of earth were cut from the ground and stacked to form walls, with wooden frameworks supporting roofs that were layered with additional sod or thatch. The dense earth walls provided insulation, keeping interiors warmer during freezing nights and cooler during occasional winter sun. Floors were sometimes layered with planks, rushes, or straw to prevent direct contact with the frozen ground. Roofs were pitched to allow snow to slide off, reducing the risk of collapse under heavy accumulation. Windows were small and sometimes covered with animal hides, oiled paper, or additional cloth layers, minimizing heat loss while letting in faint light. Doors were heavy, often reinforced with extra layers of fabric or fur, and carefully fitted to prevent drafts from undermining the hard-won warmth inside. Inside the cabin, organization and layout were equally important. The hearth was the central focus, providing heat for the room, warmth for sleeping areas, and a place to cook food. Families arranged their furniture and sleeping platforms around the hearth to maximize exposure to heat. Storage areas for food, firewood, and clothing were strategically placed to reduce exposure to cold and to facilitate easy access during storms. Insulation extended beyond walls and roofs to every part of the home. Blankets, quilts, furs, and animal hides were not only used for bedding, but also draped over furniture, walls, and doorways to conserve heat. Layers of cloth or fur blocked drafts, while additional coverings over windows reduced the chilling effect of icy panes. The careful placement of these materials often meant the difference between a tolerable night and one spent shivering. Maintenance was a constant concern. Roofs had to be reinforced to bear snow loads, chimneys cleaned and inspected, and walls checked for cracks or decay. Logs and sod could shift over time, allowing drafts to creep in, so families regularly performed repairs using available materials. Even small tasks, like filling gaps with moss or straw, could improve insulation significantly. Communities often shared techniques for shelter construction and maintenance, passing along tips for reinforcing roofs, insulating walls, and managing the interior layout for maximum warmth. Neighbors might help each other with heavy lifting, roof repairs, or snow removal. Understanding that cooperation could save lives when winter storms struck, temporary shelters were equally vital, particularly for hunters, trappers, and travelers. Snow caves, lean-tos, and canvas tents offered critical protection when permanent cabins were distant or inaccessible. These shelters required careful planning. Snow could be shaped to trap heat, branches and brush could add insulation, and entrances were often designed to reduce wind penetration. The construction of these temporary homes demanded quick thinking, resourcefulness, and a practical understanding of heat retention, often learned through trial, error, and observation of indigenous techniques. The interior of the home was organized to conserve heat efficiently. Sleeping areas were raised off the floor, often using planks or stacked materials to prevent cold from rising through bedding. Multiple layers of quilts, blankets, and furs insulated the body during sleep. Animals, such as dogs or small livestock, were sometimes brought inside partially, providing additional warmth and serving as an early warning system for predators or other dangers outside. Fire management was critical. Fires had to burn long and steadily, providing warmth through the night. Settlers learned to arrange wood to maximize heat output while minimizing smoke, often using stones to radiate warmth into the room. Ashes were managed carefully, as too many could smother the fire, but a layer of coals provided steady heat that could last for hours. The mental comfort provided by a well-maintained shelter cannot be understated. Beyond physical protection, it offered a sense of security, a place to gather, rest, and plan for the days ahead. Even in the harshest storms, families could huddle together, sharing warmth, food, and stories, reinforcing bonds and providing emotional resilience against the isolation and extremity of winter life. Children learned early how to contribute to shelter maintenance. They observed repairs, helped carry firewood, and assisted in layering blankets or furs where needed. These lessons were practical and immediate, instilling skills that could save their lives in the cold. The responsibility and understanding of shelter management became part of their daily routine, shaping their awareness of the environment and their role in family survival. Natural features were often used to enhance shelter effectiveness. Trees, hills, and rock formations could serve as windbreaks, while snow piled strategically against walls added extra insulation. debris, brush, and frozen vegetation were utilized to create buffers against gusts and cold drafts. These adaptations demonstrated settlers' observation, creativity, and ability to harness the environment to their advantage. Nighttime presented its own unique challenges. As temperatures dropped and winds rose, the cabin became the center of warmth and protection. Families layered bedding, ensured embers were maintained, and monitored the hearth to provide consistent heat. The rhythm of survival intertwined with the fire's life, the placement of clothing, and the careful sealing of every potential draft. Even minor details mattered significantly. Windows were inspected for cracks, doors adjusted to prevent gusts, and floors layered with extra materials. Chimneys were checked, and firewood replenished, all contributing to the ongoing effort of maintaining warmth and life. Beyond the physical, the shelter was a place of quiet reflection and human ingenuity. Families took pride in their craftsmanship, creativity, and the routines they had developed to endure the winter. Blankets, quilts, and furs were not only functional, but also comforting, adding color, texture, and familiarity to an otherwise harsh and unyielding landscape. Emergencies tested every aspect of shelter preparation. Roofs could collapse under heavy snow, fires might falter, or wind could breach walls unexpectedly. Contingency planning became essential. Settlers learned to reinforce weak points, create temporary windbreaks, and protect vital supplies. Community networks often provided backup support, with neighbors assisting each other in reinforcing cabins or sharing firewood during extreme storms. Even in these challenging moments, families found ways to adapt. The interior of the cabin became a place of resilience, where warmth, ingenuity, and careful attention to detail allowed life to continue. Tasks were prioritized, energy conserved, and each family member contributed to survival, maintaining a delicate balance between necessity and endurance. Nighttime routines were deliberate and careful. Families arranged sleeping areas to maximize heat, monitored the fire's embers, and ensured that water and food supplies were accessible. Small adjustments, repositioning blankets, adding furs to doors, or shifting embers made measurable differences in comfort and safety. The shelter became a living organism, constantly adjusted and maintained to meet the demands of winter. The sense of mastery and accomplishment provided by a well-maintained shelter was profound. Beyond protection, it offered confidence and stability. Families could plan daily activities with assurance, knowing that their environment, though harsh, was manageable. This sense of control, combined with the rhythmic tasks of maintenance and care, gave settlers a mental fortitude that was as important as physical warmth. Life inside the cabin revolved around rhythm and routine. Meals were prepared near the hearth, clothing and bedding managed carefully, and daily chores conducted to minimize exposure to the cold. This routine provided structure and a sense of normalcy, helping families endure the monotony, isolation, and extremity of winter months. Even small acts carried significance. Clearing snow from doorways, stacking firewood, adjusting blankets, or checking the hearth were rituals that reinforced the sense of safety and care. Every action contributed to the delicate balance between warmth, health, and survival. Shelter also had an emotional and social role. Families gathered to share stories, teach children skills, and find comfort in each other's presence. The warmth of the fire, the glow of lanterns, and the careful layering of quilts created an environment that was nurturing, offering a reprieve from the relentless cold outside. Through construction, maintenance, and adaptation, settlers transformed simple materials into structures that could withstand extreme weather. Logs, sod, furs, blankets, and fire combined with human ingenuity to create spaces where life could continue. The knowledge required for shelter survival was extensive, covering construction techniques, insulation strategies, fire management, and contingency planning. It was a form of mastery born of necessity, honed through observation, trial, and careful attention. So tonight, imagine a small log cabin or sod house standing resiliently against a snow-laden landscape. Picture the glow of the hearth, the careful layering of blankets and furs, and the work of hands both young and old, maintaining warmth and comfort. Hear the whisper of the wind outside, the creak of timbers under snow, and the quiet rhythm of family life unfolding inside. Every log, every layer of insulation, and every careful repair stands as a testament to human perseverance, ingenuity, and the quiet endurance that defined life on the frontier. Shelter was more than a structure. It was the essence of survival, a center of warmth and life, and a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, preparation, care, and skill could provide security, comfort, and continuity. The Wild West winters were formidable, yet through thoughtful construction, ongoing maintenance, and adaptation to the environment, families carved out havens where life could endure, where the cold could be managed, and where the human spirit could persist. The story of these shelters is a story of resilience, patience, and ingenuity, illustrating the extraordinary lengths to which people went to create warmth, protection, and home in a land defined by extremes, isolation, and relentless cold. Winter in the Wild West was as much a battle of sustenance as it was of warmth, and the ability to preserve food and prepare meals effectively determined whether a family could endure the long months of cold and isolation. With frozen rivers, snow-covered fields, and limited access to fresh supplies, settlers had to rely on careful planning, resourcefulness, and meticulous attention to the preservation and preparation of every edible resource. Imagine the glow of a fire in a small cabin, the scent of smoked meat filling the air, and a family working quietly together, each member participating in the tasks necessary to ensure that their provisions would last. The first priority in winter survival was ensuring that food did not spoil, as a single mistake could mean hunger or illness. Meat, often the primary source of protein, required careful handling from the moment it was hunted or butchered. Freshly caught deer, rabbit, or small game had to be cleaned immediately, with blood drained and organs removed to prevent decay. Large cuts were sometimes hung near the fire to dry, while smaller portions were placed in cold, shaded areas or buried under snow to slow decomposition. Smoke and salt were invaluable tools in the process of preservation. Smoking meat over a slow, steady fire not only cooked it, but also created an environment inhospitable to bacteria. Thin strips were hung from beams or across poles, exposed to warm smoke that penetrated the fibers, drying and flavoring the meat simultaneously. Salt, often acquired through trade or collected from natural deposits, was rubbed generously on cuts, drawing moisture out and preventing spoilage. This labor-intensive process required patience, as improperly cured, meat could quickly become inedible, while well-prepared portions could last for weeks or even months, providing a critical source of sustenance when hunting trips were unsuccessful or the landscape offered little for foraging. Fat played multiple roles in winter survival, serving both as a cooking medium and a source of high-energy calories. Animal fat was carefully rendered by heating it slowly over a fire until it liquefied, then poured into containers and stored in cool, insulated areas. This rendered fat could be used for frying, baking, or adding to stews, increasing the caloric value of meals essential for maintaining warmth and energy during the cold months. Vegetables and roots were preserved, using a variety of techniques that depended on the climate and available resources. Root cellars, often dug beneath the cabin or into hillsides, provided a naturally cool and insulated environment, ideal for storing potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onions. These underground spaces maintained temperatures just above freezing, slowing spoilage and allowing families to access fresh produce throughout the winter. Roots were sometimes layered in sand or straw to prevent contact and reduce moisture, extending their usability. Cabbage, a common winter vegetable, could be fermented to create sauerkraut, providing both nutrition and a method of preservation. Fermentation involved layering cabbage with salt in barrels or crocks, pressing it down, and allowing it to sit in a cool, dark location. The resulting tangy product retained its vitamins and could be eaten over several months, supplementing diets heavy in preserved meat and starches. Fruits were rare in winter, but could be preserved through drying, freezing, or storing in cool cellars. Berries collected in late autumn were often dried over low heat or laid out on racks near a warm fire, carefully monitored to prevent burning. Dried fruits could be eaten as snacks, added to stews, or rehydrated for cooking, providing essential nutrients and variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. Grains and legumes, though less perishable, required careful storage. Flour, cornmeal, beans, and oats were kept in tightly sealed containers to protect against moisture, pests, and contamination. Settlers learned to check storage regularly, ensuring that small rodents had not breached the containers and that grains remained dry. Failure to monitor these supplies could result in wasted food, diminished caloric intake, and hardship during particularly harsh periods. Cooking itself was an exercise in skill, resource management, and efficiency. Open hearths or wood stoves were the primary means of preparing meals, and fuel was always a concern. Fires had to burn steadily, providing heat for the home while being used to cook food. Large meals often involved slow simmering of stews, soups, or porridges, which not only cooked the ingredients thoroughly, but also maximized heat output in the cabin. Stews and soups became staples because they allowed families to stretch limited ingredients. A small portion of meat, some root vegetables, grains, and perhaps a few dried herbs could create a nourishing meal capable of feeding several people. The long cooking times allowed flavors to develop, meat to tenderize, and nutrients to be extracted into the broth, providing both warmth and sustenance. Bread and baked goods were also central to winter survival, though baking posed its own challenges. Settlers had to maintain even heat in ovens, which were often fueled by wood, and monitor baking carefully to prevent burning or undercooking. Bread provided both calories and comfort, sustaining families when fresh meat or vegetables were scarce. Some households baked only once or twice a week, making careful calculations about the quantity needed to avoid waste, while ensuring that no one went hungry. Preserving water and managing it for cooking was equally critical. Melting snow or ice over the fire provided drinking water, but large quantities were often needed for boiling vegetables, grains, or meat. Efficient use of this resource was essential, and every pot or kettle was accounted for. Families quickly learned how to multitask, using the same heat source to cook, melt snow, and keep rooms warm, ensuring that fuel and effort were maximized. Even small details could have large consequences. Utensils had to be cleaned, firewood replenished, and food rotated to prevent spoilage. Leftovers were carefully stored, sometimes reheated over the fire or incorporated into new dishes. Nothing was wasted because every morsel represented energy, warmth, and survival. The mental aspect of winter cooking was significant. Planning meals, managing limited resources, and adjusting to what the environment provided required constant awareness. Settlers had to anticipate the days ahead, predict weather changes, and account for hunting or foraging success. Mistakes could be costly, and success demanded attention, patience, and foresight. Children participated in food preparation and preservation as much as their abilities allowed. They helped gather firewood, stir pots, peel vegetables, and manage smaller tasks under the supervision of adults. These tasks were practical lessons in responsibility and survival, instilling knowledge that could one day be essential for their own endurance during harsh winters. Community networks often supplemented individual efforts. Neighbors shared knowledge of preservation techniques, traded preserved goods, and sometimes cooperated in processing large game or harvests. This exchange allowed families to access variety, learn new methods, and maintain nutrition when individual supplies were insufficient. Spices, herbs, and seasonings, though scarce, were used to enhance flavor and morale. Even a small pinch of dried herbs could make a stew or porridge more palatable, breaking the monotony of preserved food. Flavor became an important psychological tool, helping to sustain hope and comfort in an environment where monotony and scarcity could be draining. Winter meals were more than fuel. They were central to family life. Sharing a warm pot of stew around the hearth was a moment of connection, a time to exchange stories, plan for the next day, and reinforce bonds. The preparation and consumption of food became a rhythm that structured daily life, providing stability and a sense of purpose even in the coldest months. Emergencies tested even the best prepared households. A hunting trip might fail, a root cellar could freeze, or a storm might prevent access to stored provisions. Contingency planning was crucial. Families often kept hidden caches of preserved food, monitored supplies carefully, and adapted menus according to availability, ensuring that no one went hungry despite adversity. Preservation and cooking in the Wild West winter required constant adaptation to environmental conditions. Frostbite, sub-zero temperatures, and blizzards were daily threats that influenced what could be cooked, stored, and eaten. Settlers monitored weather patterns closely, adjusting fires, ovens, and storage techniques accordingly. Even minor miscalculations could lead to lost food, wasted fuel, or illness. Nutrition was carefully balanced where possible. Families combined meat, grains, vegetables, and preserved fruits to ensure adequate calories, vitamins, and energy for warmth and work. Each meal was a calculation in survival, maximizing the utility of available ingredients to support the human body against cold and exertion. Resourcefulness was celebrated. Improvised containers, inventive preservation methods, and creative meal combinations were commonplace. A handful of dried berries might be mixed into porridge, leftover stew thickened with grains, or a small portion of meat stretched across multiple meals. Ingenuity became essential, transforming scarcity into sufficiency through careful planning and skillful preparation. So tonight, imagine a small cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, the warmth of the hearth filling the space, and the smell of meat and vegetables cooking over a steady fire. Picture family members taking turns stirring pots, arranging root vegetables, and monitoring meat hanging to cure. Hear the quiet rhythm of activity, punctuated by the crackle of burning wood, and feel the sense of purpose, care, and attention that transformed survival into routine. Food preservation and winter cooking were not simply chores. They were central acts of endurance, skill, and human ingenuity. Every salted cut of meat, every dried fruit, every carefully prepared stew represented a triumph of planning, observation, and patient labor. These practices allowed families to endure extreme cold, maintain health, and preserve life in a landscape defined by harshness and scarcity. The work of food preservation and cooking in winter was a testament to human adaptability. Through careful attention to detail, creative problem-solving, and cooperation, settlers transformed the harshest environment into one in which life could continue. Every meal prepared, every root stored, and every bit of meat smoked reinforced the resilience, patience, and quiet determination that defined survival in the Wild West winter. In the Wild West, the survival of a family during winter was often tied as much to their animals as to themselves. Livestock, from cows and horses to chickens, pigs, and goats, were not simply possessions or sources of income. They were essential for sustenance, warmth, labor, and even social stability. Caring for them in a climate of snow, ice, and relentless wind was an intricate and exhausting challenge, requiring careful planning, vigilance, and an intimate understanding of both animal behavior and the environment. Imagine a homestead surrounded by frozen pastures, the wind whistling across snowdrifts, and the low, steady sound of animals moving within barns and pens. The barn, humble though it may appear, became a vital extension of the home, a heated sanctuary protecting animals from freezing temperatures that could easily kill them. Its construction was strategic. Thick wooden walls, often insulated with straw or mud, minimized drafts while allowing ventilation to prevent the buildup of ammonia from animal waste. Roofs were angled to shed snow, and gaps were meticulously sealed with boards, moss, or cloth to maintain warmth. Inside, animals were positioned with care. Cattle, for example, were grouped together to share body heat, while horses were sheltered in stalls with thick bedding of straw or hay. Chickens roosted on elevated perches, sometimes covered with cloth or straw to protect them from drafts, and pigs were given deep straw beds to burrow into. The arrangement of animals was intentional, aimed at maximizing warmth, minimizing stress, and preventing disease, as weak or exposed animals could quickly become ill and threaten the overall herd. Feeding during winter was an ongoing concern. Pastures were buried beneath snow, and foraging was largely impossible, so stored feed became the lifeline of every animal. Hay, often harvested in late summer or early autumn, was stored in lofts or sheds, kept dry and accessible despite snow and moisture. Grain, including corn, oats and barley, was rationed carefully, ensuring that every animal received sufficient calories to maintain body heat. Families measured feed daily, balancing quantity and quality to keep livestock healthy through long months without grazing. Water, too, required attention. Streams and ponds often froze over, forcing settlers to break ice or melt snow to provide drinking water. Large animals such as cows or horses needed significant amounts daily, and failure to provide adequate water could result in dehydration, illness, or death. Buckets were heated or snow melted over the hearth, then carefully transported to pens, a laborious but essential task repeated multiple times a day. Cold and wind added further complexity. Animals were susceptible to frostbite, hypothermia, and stress-induced illness, so positioning within barns, pens, or windbreaks was critical. Settlers observed their behavior closely, noting signs of discomfort or illness, adjusting bedding, rearranging stalls, and sometimes constructing temporary wind barriers to shield them from particularly harsh conditions. Some families even built small shelters for animals in the open, using logs, brush, or snow to provide temporary refuge. The maintenance of barns and pens was a constant labor. Snow was shoveled away from doors and walkways, roofs were checked for leaks, and walls reinforced when wind or storms threatened structural integrity. Bedding was replenished daily, ensuring that animals had dry, insulating materials in which to rest. Feces and soiled straw were removed to prevent the buildup of harmful bacteria and maintain hygiene, reducing the risk of disease spreading among the herd. Livestock management was a rhythm dictated by both the day and the season. Early morning feedings coincided with daylight, allowing settlers to observe animals' conditions. Midday chores might include breaking ice, reinforcing structures, or collecting eggs from roosting chickens. Evening routines involved another round of feeding, inspection, and bedding adjustments. This rhythm provided structure to life during the isolating winter months, creating a dependable routine that balanced human effort with the needs of animals. Horses and oxen, vital for transportation and labor, received particular attention. They were groomed to remove snow, ice, and dirt, which could chill them if left to accumulate. Hooves were inspected and cleared of ice or debris, ensuring that animals could walk safely on frozen or slippery terrain. Tack and harnesses were maintained to prevent chafing and injury, and animals were monitored closely for signs of fatigue or stress, as overwork could compromise health during extreme cold. Small animals also required vigilance. Chickens needed protection from drafts and predators, especially foxes or hawks that were often more desperate during winter scarcity. Pigs, goats, and sheep were monitored for signs of frostbite, cold stress, or illness, with extra bedding, supplemental feeding, or isolation provided when necessary. Families quickly learned to read the subtle cues of animal health, adjusting care accordingly. Disease management was crucial. In the close quarters of winter barns, illnesses could spread rapidly, so quarantine and careful observation were standard practices. Settlers learned to recognize early symptoms, isolate affected animals, and apply remedies where possible, often relying on herbal treatments, knowledge passed down from older generations, or improvisation when professional veterinary help was unavailable. Herding and exercise also played roles in survival. Animals that remained stationary for long periods risked stiffness, circulation problems, or stress. Settlers often encouraged movement, leading cattle or horses in small enclosures or along cleared paths to maintain physical condition. Even minimal exercise, combined with careful feeding and sheltering, helped preserve the overall health of the herd. Trade and resource management were intertwined with animal care. Livestock provided meat, milk, eggs, hides, and labor, all essential for human survival. Families carefully balanced consumption with the need to maintain the herd, sometimes selling or bartering animals to acquire other necessities. Decisions about slaughtering, milking, or breeding were made with both immediate survival and long-term sustainability in mind. Breeding cycles were also considered carefully. While winter was not ideal for birthing, families often prepared for spring arrivals by ensuring that pregnant animals were housed in insulated areas, adequately fed, and monitored closely. Protecting the next generation of livestock became a central concern, as the survival of young animals directly influenced the family's future security and livelihood. Predators posed additional challenges. Wolves, coyotes, and stray dogs often sought out weakened or unattended livestock during the winter months. Settlers built fences, reinforced pens, and sometimes kept guard dogs to deter attacks. Nighttime vigilance was common, particularly during storms when predators were emboldened by scarcity and silence made hunting easier. The psychological burden of caring for animals in extreme cold was significant. Knowing that a single oversight could cost an animal its life created stress and demanded constant attention. Families adapted by dividing tasks, sharing responsibility, and creating systems to ensure that every animal was monitored, fed, and protected. Knowledge of local climate patterns and terrain became essential. Understanding which areas of the pasture were prone to drifting snow, which winds brought the harshest chills, and how to create windbreaks using natural features all contributed to the effective management of livestock. Settlers learned through observation, trial and error, and shared wisdom, developing techniques that were often passed down for generations. Even in the harshest blizzards, the routines of animal care continued. Early morning and evening feedings could not be skipped. Water had to be provided and shelters maintained. Families worked together, braving wind and snow, to ensure that animals survived and remained productive. Children were integrated into these routines, learning early the responsibilities, risks, and rewards of livestock management. The economic and practical significance of livestock made winter survival even more critical. Cattle and pigs provided meat for food stores, milk and cheese offered nutrition, and hides could be traded or used for clothing. Horses and oxen enabled transportation, hauling firewood, or moving goods. Each animal represented an investment of labor, resources, and care, and losing even one could have cascading consequences on family survival. Adaptations were continuous. Families experimented with different bedding materials, feeding schedules, and pen arrangements. Some placed animals near walls to maximize heat retention, while others used thick layers of straw or brush to insulate enclosures. Innovative methods, like creating small windbreaks with logs or using snow strategically to reduce drafts, became part of survival knowledge. The intimate relationship between humans and their animals shaped daily life. Families developed routines, observations, and habits that revolved around livestock needs as much as their own. The rhythm of feeding, sheltering, and monitoring created a structure to winter days, providing both purpose and a sense of connection to the living world around them. So tonight, picture a snow-covered homestead with the low murmur of cows, the occasional cluck of a chicken, and the soft pawing of animals in straw-lined pens. Imagine family members carefully distributing feed, breaking ice for water, adjusting bedding, and checking animals for signs of cold, stress, or illness. Hear the quiet crackle of firewood burning, providing warmth inside while the wind howls outside. Feel the weight of responsibility, the rhythm of daily tasks, and the satisfaction of seeing animals survive, thrive, and contribute to the family's endurance. Livestock management in winter was more than work. It was a constant practice of observation, care, and adaptability. Every action, feeding, bedding, watering, reinforcing, pens, was an act of survival, ensuring that both humans and animals could endure the extreme cold together. Through vigilance, skill, and perseverance, families maintained the delicate balance that allowed life to continue on the frontier. The story of livestock in the Wild West winter is one of interdependence, patience, and quiet ingenuity. It illustrates the lengths to which settlers went to preserve life, maintain resources, and adapt to a harsh, unyielding environment. In every well-fed cow, every warm horse, and every sheltered chicken, there was a testament to human resilience, care, and the relentless effort to survive the formidable winter months in a land defined by extremes. Surviving the brutal winters of the Wild West demanded more than a sturdy shelter or preserved food. It required careful attention to clothing and personal protection, an understanding that warmth was not simply about having a fire, but about covering the body in layers designed to trap heat, block wind, and shield against frostbite. Every item worn, every layer chosen, was part of a carefully orchestrated strategy that settlers relied upon to endure months of sub-zero temperatures, snow, and biting winds. Imagine a settler stepping outside into a blizzard, each layer of clothing acting as armor against the relentless cold, boots crunching through drifts of snow, mittens and scarves shielding exposed skin, and hats pulled low to trap warmth around the head and neck. Clothing in the frontier was practical, durable, and highly valued because failure to dress properly could mean illness or even death. Wool was perhaps the most essential material. Thick, hand-spun wool provided insulation even when damp, wicking moisture away from the body while retaining heat. Coats, pants, and blankets made from wool were carefully maintained, mended when torn, and layered strategically over other garments. Wool socks were crucial, often doubled or even tripled in extreme conditions to protect feet from frostbite. Animal hides were another cornerstone of frontier clothing. Leather from cattle, deer, or buffalo was fashioned into boots, gloves, coats, and leggings, treated to resist moisture and wind. Fur, whether left on hides or sewn into garments, added an additional layer of insulation. A fur-lined coat, muff, or hat could make the difference between warmth and debilitating cold, especially during long journeys across snow-covered plains. Layering was a skill and an art. Settlers understood that multiple thin layers trapped heat more effectively than a single heavy garment. Undergarments, often made of linen or wool, provided a base layer to wick moisture and keep skin dry. Middle layers added insulation, such as woolen shirts, vests, or additional trousers. Outer layers, including heavy coats, capes, or leather jackets, shielded against wind, snow, and rain. Scarves, shawls, and hoods protected the face and neck, areas particularly susceptible to frostbite. Gloves and mittens were essential, and many families carried multiple pairs, allowing them to swap wet or frozen gloves for dry ones. Mittens were favored for warmth, as fingers sharing space generated more heat than being separated in gloves. When handling tools, chopping wood, or tending animals, settlers sometimes used leather coverings over woolen gloves, creating a barrier that combined dexterity with protection. Footwear was equally critical. Boots had to be insulated, water-resistant, and durable, with soles thick enough to provide traction on icy surfaces. Some families stuffed boots with straw or wool for added warmth. Moccasins, lined with fur or worn over woolen socks, were used by some settlers and indigenous guides, providing flexible warmth and comfort for long treks in deep snow. Hats and head coverings served multiple functions. Woolen caps, felt hats, or fur-lined hoods prevented heat loss from the head, where significant warmth could escape. Ear flaps, scarves, or wraps protected the face and neck from biting wind. Even when traveling, settlers kept these coverings adjusted carefully, balancing warmth with visibility and mobility. Maintaining clothing in winter was a continuous effort. Moisture from snow, sweat, or water could compromise insulation, so garments were dried near the hearth whenever possible. Wool and fur were fluffed and aired to retain loft and warmth. Tears or worn spots were mended immediately, as even a small breach could allow cold to penetrate. Knowledge of sewing, patching, and preserving materials was an essential survival skill, passed down through generations or learned through necessity. Children were dressed with particular care. Layering was adjusted based on activity, ensuring that they stayed warm while playing, tending animals, or assisting in chores. Clothing for children was often made slightly larger to allow for underlayers, and mittens and boots were checked regularly for fit and dryness. Teaching children to manage their own garments, adjust scarves, and protect exposed skin became part of their education in survival. Settlers also adapted clothing based on activity and terrain. Hunting required silent, flexible garments that allowed movement while still providing insulation. Work around the cabin or barn required durability, as wool or leather could be subjected to repeated abrasion. Traveling across deep snow or icy terrain necessitated additional layers, foot coverings, and protective outerwear to prevent injury or exposure. Improvisation was frequent. Settlers sometimes used extra blankets or quilted materials to supplement clothing, wrapping themselves in additional layers when storms hit unexpectedly. Furs from hunted animals were repurposed for coats, mittens, and hats, creating a constant cycle of resourcefulness where survival depended on maximizing every available material. Protection extended beyond clothing to the careful management of moisture. Wet clothing could be deadly in sub-zero temperatures, as evaporation pulled heat from the body. Settlers monitored snowfall, rain, and sweat, changing garments when possible and keeping spare clothing near the hearth to dry quickly. Every task, from chopping wood to gathering firewood, was performed with attention to keeping clothes dry and functional. Layering also involved strategic removal. While working near the fire, tending animals, or performing strenuous tasks, settlers often removed or loosened outer layers to prevent overheating and sweat accumulation. This careful management of clothing ensured that garments retained their insulating properties rather than becoming damp and ineffective. Accessories like scarves, wraps, and gaiters provided added protection against wind and snow. Settlers often wrapped scarves multiple times around the neck and face, tucking them into coats to prevent drafts. Gaiters, made from wool or leather, protected the lower legs and ankles from snow and moisture, critical when walking through drifts or working outdoors for extended periods. The layering system also extended to bedding and sleeping arrangements. Quilts, blankets, and furs were used not only for warmth in bed, but also to supplement clothing. Settlers would layer themselves in the same manner they dressed, ensuring that sleep was safe, insulated, and restorative. In the extreme cold, even small animals were incorporated into this system, sleeping close to children or adults to provide additional warmth through shared body heat. Seasonal adjustments were common. Early winter might require fewer layers, while the peak of cold necessitated maximum insulation. Settlers observed weather patterns and adjusted clothing accordingly, preparing for storms or extreme temperature drops. Awareness of environmental conditions was critical, as misjudging the necessary protection could lead to frostbite, hypothermia, or impaired mobility. Hygiene and clothing care intersected with survival. Wool and fur garments needed cleaning to maintain insulation, reduce odors, and prevent infestation by lice or other pests. Washing was carefully managed to avoid soaking clothes, often using cold or lukewarm water and rapid drying near the fire. Leather was treated to maintain flexibility and water resistance, while fur was brushed or fluffed to preserve insulating properties. Clothing was also a social and psychological tool. Well-maintained garments, even in the harshest conditions, provided dignity, comfort, and a sense of control over the environment. Wearing layers properly, adjusting scarves and mittens, and keeping boots dry were acts of both survival and self-respect, reinforcing the human capacity to adapt to extreme circumstances. Children learned by example, observing adults dress carefully, layer effectively, and manage their clothing throughout the day. They learned the importance of mittens, scarves, boots, and hats, understanding that attention to detail could prevent pain, frostbite, or illness. This knowledge became second nature, forming the foundation of their winter survival skills. Community knowledge contributed significantly to clothing strategies. Families shared techniques for layering, treating hides, and insulating garments. They exchanged wool, fur, and materials, and taught one another how to improvise when resources were limited. Advice from experienced settlers or indigenous guides informed the most effective approaches to personal protection, blending tradition with practical adaptation to the environment. Travel and outdoor work demanded additional ingenuity. Settlers moving across snowy terrain carried extra layers, waterproof coverings, and protective accessories to shield against wind and moisture. Knowledge of local geography, wind patterns, and snow accumulation informed decisions about when to add or remove layers, how to protect exposed skin, and how to preserve energy while working. Clothing in winter was more than protection. It was a lifeline, a system of insulation, moisture management, and adaptation that allowed settlers to maintain health, energy, and mobility. Every garment, accessory, and layer was chosen with purpose, maintained with care, and used strategically to endure months of relentless cold. So tonight, imagine a settler pulling on multiple layers of wool and leather, adjusting a scarf across the face, tightening boots stuffed with straw, and securing a fur-lined hat low over the head. Picture children copying the motions, hands encased in mittens, boots crunching through snow, and breath visible in the frigid air. Hear the quiet swish of clothing brushing against itself, the shuffle of boots on frozen ground, and the careful movements that preserve warmth and protect life. The story of winter clothing in the Wild West is one of observation, skill, and adaptation. It demonstrates the intricate knowledge required to endure harsh climates, the practical ingenuity necessary to manage limited resources, and the quiet resilience of families who understood that survival depended on meticulous attention to every layer covering the body. Through wool, fur, leather, and fabric, settlers created a protective shell that allowed them to work, travel, and live in a world defined by extremes. They mastered layering, moisture management, and practical maintenance, ensuring that even in the coldest conditions, warmth, mobility, and comfort could be maintained. Every coat mended, every scarf wrapped, and every boot insulated represented foresight, skill, and the determination to survive. Winter clothing was not merely about protection from the elements. It was a manifestation of human ingenuity, care, and persistence, a vital part of life that allowed settlers to endure the unforgiving cold, preserve health, and maintain the routines, labor, and social bonds necessary to survive in the Wild West. Winter in the Wild West was a season of endurance, not merely because of snow, wind, and cold, but because the human body and mind were constantly tested by exposure, limited nutrition, and the threat of illness. Settlers understood that survival was not only about shelter, food, and clothing, but also about maintaining health and addressing sickness promptly before it became fatal. Every cough, fever, or chill had the potential to escalate into something much worse, and families relied on a combination of observation, folk remedies, and practical care to navigate the dangers of winter illness. Imagine a small cabin, the warmth of the hearth surrounding a family, as they tend to a sick child or monitor a parent weakened by exposure. The smell of herbs and boiling water fills the air, and the rhythm of life adjusts to accommodate the care of the unwell. The first line of defense was prevention. Families were vigilant about maintaining warmth, ensuring that clothing layers were adequate, bedding was dry and insulated, and the home itself was protected from drafts. Exposure to cold and moisture could weaken the body's defenses, making individuals more susceptible to illness, so attention to warmth and dryness was considered essential. Nutrition was equally crucial. A well-fed body had more energy to fight off illness, maintain warmth, and recover from minor ailments. Settlers ensured that families received a balance of protein, fats, and carbohydrates, often supplementing winter staples with preserved vegetables, dried fruits, and dairy products to maintain strength. Even small additions like a bit of sauerkraut or dried berries contributed essential vitamins that helped prevent deficiencies. Observation was a key skill in health management. Parents, older siblings, and neighbors learned to recognize early signs of illness, from slight fevers to changes in behavior, appetite, or energy levels. Early detection allowed for timely intervention, often with simple measures such as increasing warmth, adjusting diet, or applying traditional remedies. The isolation of frontier life meant that professional medical care was not readily accessible, so knowledge of home remedies was essential. Herbal treatments were common, passed down through generations or adapted from indigenous knowledge. Willow bark, known for its pain-relieving properties, could be brewed into a tea for fevers and aches. Echinacea, sage, and peppermint were used to soothe respiratory issues, while chamomile or lemon balm provided relief for digestive discomfort or to calm restlessness. Boiling water and steam were applied to clear congestion, and poultices made from heated herbs or clay were used to ease aches, reduce inflammation, or draw out infection. Hygiene played a surprisingly large role in winter health. Even in freezing conditions, settlers made efforts to keep themselves and their living spaces as clean as possible. Simple practices, such as washing hands before handling food, maintaining clean bedding, and removing waste and spoiled food from the cabin, reduced the risk of disease spreading in confined, insulated environments. Water sources were monitored for cleanliness, as frozen or contaminated water could cause illness if used for cooking or drinking. Clothing and bedding hygiene also contributed to health. Wool, linen, and fur garments were brushed, aired, and repaired to prevent lice, skin irritation, and the buildup of bacteria. Blankets and quilts were shaken, dried, and aired over fires to maintain freshness and preserve warmth, minimizing the risk of skin infections or respiratory issues from damp, cold fabrics. Respiratory illnesses were a constant concern. Cold, dry air, combined with indoor smoke from fires, made coughs, colds, and pneumonia common. Families responded with layered clothing, warm drinks, and exposure moderation, limiting the time spent outdoors during storms or extreme cold. Hot broths, teas, and infusions were used to maintain hydration, soothe throats, and provide essential nutrients. In cases of more severe illness, isolation within the home was necessary to prevent the spread of disease. Sick family members were cared for in a designated area, often near the warmth of the hearth, with blankets, hot water, and nourishment to support recovery. Children, who were especially vulnerable to cold and respiratory conditions, received particular attention, with careful monitoring, additional layers, and frequent feeding to maintain energy and warmth. Injuries were another challenge during the winter months. Slips on ice, accidents with tools, or animal-related injuries could become dangerous if not treated promptly. Settlers kept supplies of bandages, salves, and antiseptics on hand, often using alcohol, honey, or herbal preparations to clean wounds and prevent infection. Splints were fashioned from wood to immobilize broken or sprained limbs, while stitches or binding with strips of cloth were sometimes used for more severe cuts. Fever management was crucial. A mild fever might be treated with rest, warmth, and herbal teas, while higher fevers required careful monitoring. Cooling or warming strategies were applied depending on the specific ailment, and hydration was maintained to support the body's natural defenses. Sleep was a fundamental component of health, and the cold environment demanded careful attention to bedding, layering, and warmth. Resting in insulated, dry beds, surrounded by furs and blankets, allowed the body to recover and maintain energy levels for the next day's chores. Even minor disruptions in sleep could compromise immunity and exacerbate illness, so families took measures to ensure comfortable sleeping conditions. Mental health, though less discussed, was intimately linked to physical health. The isolation and monotony of winter, combined with the constant vigilance required for survival, could cause stress and anxiety. Families mitigated this through routines, storytelling, shared tasks, and communal activities that provided comfort and stability. Engaging the mind, maintaining social bonds, and creating small moments of enjoyment were subtle but powerful tools for sustaining overall health. Chronic conditions and disabilities required additional care. Elderly or infirm family members needed extra warmth, more frequent monitoring, and assistance with daily tasks such as feeding, dressing, and using the outhouse. Settlers often adapted their environment, creating warm sleeping areas near the fire, using additional blankets and furs, and providing help with chores that required mobility. Vaccines and modern medicine were largely unavailable, so prevention, observation, and early treatment were the main strategies against common winter ailments. This made knowledge, attentiveness, and preparation invaluable. Families learned to recognize patterns in illness, identify effective remedies, and adapt practices based on experience. Nutrition, warmth, hygiene, and careful observation became intertwined components of a comprehensive approach to winter health. Community support also played a significant role. Neighbors shared remedies, assisted with care for the sick, and sometimes provided food or firewood for those who were too ill to manage chores. This informal network of aid created resilience, helping families survive when illness struck and reducing the risk of isolation, compounding health problems. Water management was critical not only for drinking but also for hygiene and wound care. Settlers melted snow, filtered water when possible, and boiled it for drinking or medicinal use. Hot compresses and steam were often employed for respiratory ailments, while warm water provided comfort and cleanliness for those recovering from illness. Nutrition remained central to health management. Families prepared soups, stews, and porridges enriched with meat, root vegetables, grains, and occasionally preserved fruits. These meals provided energy, warmth, and essential vitamins, supporting recovery from illness and maintaining strength for those still working and tending animals. Alcohol and tinctures, often homemade, were sometimes used to treat pain or minor ailments, though care was taken to avoid overuse. Observation of animals also informed human health practices. Livestock behavior could indicate environmental hazards, such as contaminated water or extreme cold, allowing families to take precautions for themselves. Similarly, the health of animals often mirrored the overall conditions of the homestead, offering subtle cues about potential risks or the need for intervention. Isolation and the harsh environment required mental resilience. Families cultivated patience, discipline, and careful attention to maintain health in winter. They understood that prevention was as important as treatment, and that even small lapses in care could have significant consequences. The rhythms of daily chores, feeding animals, maintaining fires, and preparing meals were all structured to preserve energy, warmth, and overall well-being. So tonight, picture a family tending to a sick child near the hearth, steam rising from a pot of medicinal herbs, furs layered over blankets, and the quiet vigilance of parents monitoring temperature and symptoms. Hear the subtle crackle of firewood, the soft movements of caretakers, and the occasional cough or sigh of the recovering. Every act stirring a pot, adjusting layers, offering a sip of warm broth is part of the delicate balance that allowed life to continue in a harsh, unforgiving winter. Health management in the Wild West was a constant practice of observation, care, and adaptation. Every layer of clothing, every preserved food item, every herbal remedy and poultice contributed to the overall effort to survive the extreme cold. Families learned through experience, trial and error, and shared knowledge, developing systems that sustained life and allowed recovery when illness struck. Winter in the Wild West was a time of quiet diligence, where the rhythms of life, attention to detail, and care for each other created resilience against illness. Every cough monitored, every wound treated, every precaution taken was a testament to human ingenuity, persistence, and the subtle mastery of survival. In these moments of careful tending, families cultivated not only physical resilience, but also a sense of security and hope, reinforcing the bonds that sustained them through long months of isolation and cold. The story of health in the frontier winter is one of patience, vigilance, and subtle intelligence. It is the story of families who learned to interpret every symptom, observe every change, and apply knowledge with care, ensuring that even in extreme conditions, life continued, warmth was preserved, and survival was possible. Every poultice applied, every fever monitored, and every restorative meal prepared demonstrates the quiet heroism of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, their efforts woven into the fabric of frontier winter life. Winter in the Wild West was not endured by individuals alone. Survival depended as much on community cooperation and social networks as it did on personal skill, preparation, and resilience. In a landscape of isolation, snowbound homesteads, and relentless cold, neighbors became allies, teachers, and lifelines, creating an informal web of support that ensured that families could survive when adversity struck. Imagine a snow-covered valley dotted with cabins, smoke rising from chimneys, and groups of settlers traveling cautiously along frozen trails to share resources, exchange knowledge, or lend a helping hand. The harshness of winter demanded that no one relied solely on their own labor, knowledge, or supplies. Cooperation began with the simplest forms of communication and observation. Families watched over one another, noting who might be short on firewood, who had sick children, or which homesteads were threatened by blizzards or drifting snow. In some cases, settlers would travel through dangerous snowdrifts to deliver wood, food, or news, understanding that the survival of neighbors was intertwined with their own. Sharing knowledge was equally vital. Experienced settlers taught newcomers about local weather patterns, snowdrifts, and the most effective ways to protect homes and animals from the cold. Tips on preserving food, layering clothing, and managing livestock in winter were exchanged freely, often around fires where storytelling blended instruction with comfort. This exchange of wisdom could mean the difference between life and death, providing practical guidance born of experience that no manual or distant advice could match. Work was often communal. Tasks too large for a single household, such as chopping firewood, repairing roofs, or digging paths through deep snow, were shared among neighbors. Teams formed to tackle these labor-intensive chores, rotating effort and ensuring that no family faced impossible odds alone. In some communities, barn raising or cabin repairs in winter were common, reflecting the understanding that collective action strengthened everyone's chances of survival. Food and resources were also shared. Families exchanged preserved meat, grains, and root vegetables, supplementing diets and providing variety when individual stores ran low. Eggs, butter, and milk might be shared between households, or surplus wood and coal traded to ensure that each home had sufficient warmth. Even small exchanges, such as lending a pair of gloves or a warm blanket, carried profound significance, as each act reduced the immediate risk of illness, frostbite, or deprivation. Children played a role in community cooperation as well. Older children often assisted in delivering firewood or food to neighbors, learning the importance of mutual aid and building bonds that would become critical as they matured. Even play served a subtle function, keeping young ones active, preserving body warmth, and reinforcing social cohesion in an environment that could otherwise feel isolating and threatening. The social aspect of winter survival extended beyond material aid to emotional support. Long nights, confined cabins, and relentless cold could weigh heavily on spirits. Settlers relied on shared storytelling, songs, and conversation to maintain morale, pass down traditions, and keep fear and despair at bay. Visiting neighbors, even briefly, offered warmth, companionship, and reassurance that they were not facing the winter alone. Seasonal celebrations, small feasts, or communal projects provided structure and meaning to winter life, breaking the monotony and reinforcing bonds between families. Community vigilance was also a defensive strategy. Wolves, coyotes, and other predators became more desperate during harsh winters, threatening both livestock and humans. Settlers organized watch shifts, constructed fences, and alerted neighbors to dangers. A single family might be able to protect its animals, but cooperation ensured that larger herds and the community as a whole were safer. Knowledge of local geography, weather, and hazards was often shared collectively. Neighbors warned one another about frozen rivers, snowdrifts, or potential avalanche. Settlers learned which paths were safest for travel and which areas posed the greatest risk of being trapped by storms. These shared observations allowed families to plan journeys, hunting trips, or resource collection with a higher chance of safety. Trade networks extended these communal efforts. Families often bartered goods such as preserved meat, furs, or handcrafted items in exchange for essentials they lacked. These trades allowed settlements to maintain a balance of resources, providing access to items critical for survival when self-sufficiency alone was insufficient. Collaboration also extended to livestock management. Families would sometimes pool animals during extreme cold, sheltering them together to share body heat or feed resources more efficiently. Skilled neighbors might assist with birthing livestock, treating illness, or mending enclosures. These acts of cooperation ensured that both animals and humans had the best chance of weathering the winter months. Practical instruction often accompanied these communal activities. Settlers demonstrated how to build windbreaks, insulate homes, manage frozen water sources, and tend fires safely. Observing and participating in these practices allowed less experienced settlers to acquire skills quickly, reducing their vulnerability to the winter's dangers. Emergencies strengthened the sense of interdependence. Snowstorms could block access to supplies, and illness could strike suddenly. Families relied on neighbors to deliver food, provide medical advice, or help with chores when individuals were incapacitated. The understanding that survival required cooperation created a culture of vigilance, generosity, and practical problem-solving. Communication, though limited by technology, was maintained through trails, messengers, and signals. Settlers developed simple methods for alerting neighbors to danger, requesting assistance, or coordinating tasks. Even in extreme conditions, these channels allowed communities to function effectively, ensuring that no family was entirely isolated when disaster struck. Seasonal labor was coordinated among neighbors. Early winter might involve cutting and storing wood collectively, while midwinter focused on feeding livestock and maintaining shelter. Shared responsibilities reduced the burden on any single household, allowed for skill specialization, and maximized efficiency in a challenging environment. Observing the success and failure of neighbors provided lessons for all. Families noticed which strategies for food preservation, clothing, or livestock management worked best, adapting their own routines accordingly. This informal observational learning reinforced community knowledge, ensuring that each winter built upon the experience of those who had come before. Even small gestures of kindness were significant. Lending a tool, sharing a warm drink, or offering a temporary place near the hearth could make the difference between health and illness, comfort and suffering. In a harsh winter, these acts were not just social niceties but practical survival strategies, creating networks of support that extended both materially and psychologically. Children learned about empathy, responsibility, and cooperation through these interactions. They observed adults assisting neighbors, sharing food, and responding to emergencies. In turn, they participated by carrying small items, helping animals, or assisting elderly or infirm neighbors, internalizing lessons of mutual reliance and community care that would serve them in later life. Winter also demanded adaptation in travel and resource collection. Settlers coordinated journeys to minimize risk, sometimes traveling in groups to gather firewood, hunt game, or deliver supplies. Shared knowledge of safe routes, local hazards, and the behavior of animals improved outcomes, reducing the likelihood of accidents or getting lost in snowbound terrain. Community gatherings reinforced cohesion. Even brief meetings at a neighbor's cabin could exchange news, share techniques, or provide moral support. Settlers often used these opportunities to discuss winter strategies, warn of environmental dangers, or celebrate small successes, maintaining morale and a sense of collective resilience. In some regions, neighbors organized cooperative ventures for large-scale tasks, such as reinforcing levees, harvesting remaining crops, or repairing essential infrastructure before winter set in. These activities required planning, trust, and collaboration, illustrating that survival in the Wild West was rarely a purely individual endeavor. Sharing stories, songs, and histories around fires served a practical function as well, preserving cultural knowledge, teaching younger generations essential skills, and providing comfort. These moments of narrative exchange helped maintain mental well-being and reinforced social bonds, creating networks of care that supported both physical survival and emotional endurance. Families also coordinated care for the sick. When illness struck, neighbors provided assistance, delivering food, tending fires, or helping with chores that the ill could not manage. This informal health network extended survival capacity beyond what a single household could achieve alone. Observation of neighboring homesteads offered important lessons in resilience. Settlers watched how others managed livestock, stored food, insulated homes, or organized daily routines, adapting strategies that proved successful and avoiding mistakes that had caused hardship elsewhere. Resourcefulness was often shared, including tips for preserving wood, treating clothing, or improvising shelters, spreading practical knowledge across the community. The cumulative effect of these cooperative practices was a network of interdependence that sustained life through the harshest conditions. Every act of assistance, every shared resource, every exchanged piece of knowledge reinforced survival, strengthened relationships, and reduced vulnerability. In the midst of blizzards, sub-zero nights, and long stretches of isolation, these social structures were as critical as firewood, clothing, or food stores. So tonight, picture a small settlement, each cabin emitting a warm glow. Neighbors moving carefully along snowy paths to share wood, deliver food, or lend aid. Imagine children helping carry supplies, adults exchanging advice and tools, and the quiet camaraderie that grows when survival depends on collaboration. Hear the crunch of snow under boots, the murmur of conversation, the occasional laughter or song, and the subtle rhythm of life maintained through mutual support. Winter survival in the Wild West was as much a social endeavor as a physical one. Community knowledge, cooperation, and shared labor created a safety net that individual skill alone could not provide. Families learned to rely on one another, to share wisdom, and to offer assistance, understanding that their own endurance was inseparable from that of their neighbors. Every shared meal, cooperative task, and act of kindness strengthened the fabric of frontier life, demonstrating that human connection was a vital component of survival in extreme conditions. The story of community cooperation in winter is one of interdependence, foresight, and shared resilience. It illustrates how settlers adapted not only to the physical environment, but also to the social challenges of isolation and scarcity. Every journey made to deliver supplies, every lesson shared around a fire, every moment of vigilance and aid contributed to the collective ability to endure, recover, and thrive despite the formidable cold. It is a story of quiet heroism, not in grand gestures but in the everyday acts of care, attention, and collaboration that allowed families to survive, maintain health, and preserve life through the long, relentless winter months. As the harsh winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the Wild West, settlers observed subtle changes in the landscape, signaling the approach of thaw and the promise of spring. Snowdrifts receded, ice on rivers and ponds cracked and melted, and the first signs of life returned to the land. Yet even as relief approached, the lessons of survival lingered in every homestead, in every barn, in every weary yet determined body that had endured months of relentless cold. Preparing for the thaw was both practical and symbolic. It marked a transition from a season of vigilance and endurance to one of renewal and opportunity. Settlers began to assess the condition of their homes, clothing, and tools, noting what had endured the winter and what required repair or replacement. Roofs that had borne heavy snow were inspected for damage, wooden beams examined for rot or warping caused by moisture, and fences that had been buried beneath drifts were dug out, repaired, and reinforced. This work was necessary to ensure that the coming spring did not catch the family unprepared, and it allowed settlers to take stock of the winter's successes and failures. Livestock was a particular focus. Animals that had survived the extreme cold now required additional attention as the weather warmed. Winter feed was largely depleted, and pastures, still muddy and barren, could not yet support grazing. Settlers supplemented the animals' diet with stored hay, grain, and any leftover forage, monitoring for weakness or illness that may have developed during the months of scarcity. Horses and oxen, fatigued by labor and exposure, were rested and cared for, their hooves checked for cracks or damage, and their coats brushed and cleaned as a ritual of recovery. Attention also turned to humans whose bodies had been tested by months of cold, limited nutrition, and continuous labor. Settlers observed the lingering effects of frostbite, minor illnesses, or weakened immune systems, ensuring that health was restored before the demands of spring planting, travel, or construction resumed. The process of thaw also carried risks. Melting snow created slick, muddy terrain, increasing the chances of slips, falls, and injury. Rivers and streams, swollen by melting ice, could flood, threatening crops, homes, and infrastructure. Settlers remained cautious, applying the same vigilance learned during the depths of winter to these new hazards, understanding that survival depended not only on enduring cold, but on navigating the transitions it imposed on the land. Social cohesion, strengthened during the winter months, continued to play a vital role during the thaw. Neighbors assisted one another with clearing debris, repairing structures, and tending livestock. Children, whose winter duties had been limited by snow and cold, now helped more actively in outdoor tasks, learning the skills and work ethic that would carry them through the rest of the year. Cooperation was not merely practical, it reinforced morale, a reminder that the community had endured together and would continue to face challenges as one. Families reflected quietly on the lessons learned over the winter. They considered the strategies that had succeeded: insulated clothing, layered bedding, shared labor, careful observation of health, and resource management, and those that had failed or required improvement. These reflections informed future preparation, guiding decisions about planting schedules, stockpiling feed, maintaining tools, and organizing community support. Mental resilience, honed through months of isolation and adversity, emerged as one of the most enduring strengths of frontier life. The rhythm of survival, learned through repeated exposure to hardship, instilled patience, attention to detail, and the ability to endure discomfort without despair. These qualities were essential not only for immediate survival, but for thriving in a landscape defined by extremes of temperature, isolation, and unpredictability. As the thaw progressed, the land itself became a teacher. Settlers observed melting ice, emerging plant life, and returning wildlife, learning to interpret signs of environmental change. Understanding the rhythms of the land allowed them to anticipate flooding, prepare for planting, and resume hunting or foraging with greater safety and efficiency. These observations, combined with the experience of winter survival, created a holistic understanding of the environment, blending practical skill with an intimate knowledge of the natural world. Spring preparations also involved repairing and improving clothing and bedding. Garments worn through months of snow, ice, and wind were mended, washed, and stored for future use. Blankets, quilts, and furs were cleaned, dried, and inspected, ensuring that they remained serviceable for the next winter. This ritual of maintenance reinforced the importance of care, foresight, and the preservation of resources, lessons that had proven critical during the harsh months just past. Community gatherings became more frequent and purposeful. With the worst of the cold receding, neighbors exchanged news, shared surplus food, and collaborated on labor-intensive projects that were difficult or impossible during winter. Repairing fences, planting crops, and preparing irrigation systems required combined effort, and the cohesion built through winter cooperation facilitated efficiency, trust, and mutual support in these tasks. Children, now accustomed to winter routines, embraced the increased activity with energy and curiosity. Their understanding of labor, resourcefulness, and cooperation deepened as they participated more actively in planting, tending livestock, and assisting adults with construction or repairs. The experiences of winter, combined with the emerging rhythms of spring, created a continuity of skill, knowledge, and resilience that shaped both daily life and long-term survival. Settlers also reflected on the personal growth engendered by winter hardships. The season demanded patience, adaptability, and ingenuity. Every challenge, from keeping livestock alive to managing scarce food, protecting against frostbite, and coordinating communal support, fostered resilience, practical intelligence, and a quiet confidence in human capacity to endure. This psychological fortitude became a resource as valuable as food, firewood, or clothing. The transition from winter to thaw highlighted the interplay between human effort and the natural world. Settlers recognized that survival was not simply a matter of exertion or willpower. but also of observation, understanding, and working in harmony with the rhythms of the environment. The land had dictated the pace of life, the distribution of labor, and the strategies for survival, and respect for these patterns was essential. Renewal extended beyond physical and practical considerations. The thaw inspired hope, optimism, and a sense of accomplishment. Surviving the winter reinforced the community's sense of capability and cohesion, fostering confidence in facing future challenges, whether in the coming summer storms, drought, or subsequent winters. Even minor successes, such as keeping a family healthy, preserving livestock, or repairing a roof, became symbolic victories, affirming human resilience in the face of natural adversity. Preparations for spring planting, hunting, and trade were guided by lessons learned during winter. Settlers understood the importance of storing surplus, pacing labor, and managing risk, integrating these insights into their routines to maximize efficiency and survival throughout the year. Knowledge of which crops thrived, which animals required special care, and which tools were essential was reinforced by direct experience, creating a practical wisdom rooted in lived reality rather than theory. Observation remained critical. Signs of wildlife returning, the melting of rivers and ponds, and the early sprouting of vegetation indicated both opportunity and hazard. Settlers interpreted these cues to plan activities, predict resource availability, and adjust strategies. This attentiveness to subtle environmental changes was cultivated through the long months of winter vigilance, demonstrating the continuity of skill and learning. Health and wellness remained priorities even as winter's harshness receded. Families continued to monitor nutrition, hygiene, and physical condition, understanding that recovery from cold, fatigue, and minor illness was essential to maintain strength for upcoming labor-intensive months. Warmth, clothing care, and attention to livestock continued to be part of daily routines, reflecting the integrated approach to survival that defined frontier life. Community storytelling, music, and shared reflections celebrated endurance, reinforced cultural knowledge, and strengthened social bonds. Tales of winter challenges, personal ingenuity, and acts of kindness were recounted, preserving memory and reinforcing collective identity. These narratives were a form of education and reassurance, passing down practical skills while inspiring courage, creativity, and resilience. The physical environment itself demanded continued effort. Snowmelt could flood low-lying areas, destabilize buildings, and wash out paths or fences. Settlers worked together to mitigate these effects, digging channels, reinforcing structures, and coordinating labor to ensure that progress toward spring planting or construction was not hindered. Every action was informed by the memory of winter hardship, combining prudence with renewed energy and optimism. Resource management remained at the forefront. Families inventoried remaining food stores, repaired tools, and prepared for upcoming labor. Every item used or saved was weighed carefully, reflecting the lessons learned in scarcity, the value of foresight, and the delicate balance between consumption and preservation that had sustained them through the coldest months. Children, now fully integrated into practical work, observed and participated in this transition. They carried firewood, tended animals, assisted in repairs, and learned to interpret environmental cues, blending play with responsibility and developing skills that would sustain them through future seasons. Their experience of winter survival became a foundational element of education, rooted in observation, participation, and gradual mastery of the natural and human-made environment. Reflection extended to human resilience and adaptability. Settlers recognized that their endurance during winter had strengthened both body and mind, creating habits, skills, and confidence that would serve them in all aspects of frontier life. The ability to persevere through discomfort, scarcity, and isolation was both a personal achievement and a shared cultural value, shaping identity and daily practice. Even as spring emerged, the memory of winter's intensity lingered, influencing decision-making, planning, and interpersonal relationships. Families approached labor, resource management, and community engagement with the awareness that preparedness, cooperation, and vigilance were essential. The lessons of winter informed behavior, choices, and attitudes, embedding a subtle wisdom that guided life on the frontier year-round. The thaw also brought opportunities for renewal, celebration, and creativity. Gardens were planted, livestock grazed on emerging grasses, and homes were cleaned and refreshed. the tactile experience of warmth, movement, and growth after months of confinement brought relief and joy. Yet it was tempered by the knowledge that the environment could quickly shift, demanding renewed vigilance and adaptability. So tonight, picture the settlement as the snow melts, smoke rising from chimneys, and families emerging to survey their land and livestock. Children explore the thawing landscape, cautiously splashing in puddles, while adults repair, mend, and prepare for planting. Hear the sound of flowing water, the soft murmur of conversation, and the rhythm of daily work resuming after months of endurance. Every gesture, from lifting a shovel to adjusting a boot, reflects the integration of experience, skill, and human spirit cultivated during the harsh winter months. The story of enduring winter in the Wild West concludes with this season of transition, a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the quiet courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary conditions. Every action, from layering clothing to tending livestock, from observing the land to cooperating with neighbors, demonstrates the ingenuity, care, and determination that allowed life to persist and thrive despite formidable challenges. The thaw is both an ending and a beginning, a moment to reflect, celebrate, and prepare for future seasons. It is a reminder that human perseverance, when combined with knowledge, cooperation, and attentiveness, can overcome even the harshest forces of nature. And as settlers stand at the threshold of spring, surveying the fruits of their endurance, they carry with them the lessons of survival, the bonds of community, and the quiet enduring strength that defined life in the Wild West. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine the frozen landscape slowly giving way to warmth, the snow melting into flowing streams, and the distant laughter of children exploring a renewed world. Picture the steady hands of parents and neighbors working together to repair, nourish, and prepare, and feel the profound resilience of people who endured one of the most challenging seasons imaginable, emerging stronger, wiser, and connected to the land and to one another. The winter has passed, but its lessons remain, quietly shaping every moment, every decision, and every act of survival, a testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and the indomitable spirit of life in the Wild West. And now, as the last traces of snow fade and the cold winds of the frontier settle into memory, you can let yourself rest. Imagine the cabins quiet, the hearths warm, and families breathing easy after months of endurance. Picture the soft crunch of boots on melting snow, the gentle murmur of neighbors tending to their land, and the first hints of spring sunlight painting the landscape. Tonight, let your mind drift through those snow-covered valleys and frozen rivers, through the resilience and quiet courage of ordinary people surviving in extraordinary conditions. Carry with you the warmth of fires, the softness of layered furs, and the gentle rhythm of life that persisted even in the harshest winter. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the frontier calm settle over you. Good night, traveler, and may your dreams wander through the quiet, enduring world of the Wild West, where survival met ingenuity, and every season carried its own lessons of patience, courage, and hope.